The Mojave wasteland was built on a mass grave, not in the story, in the code. The terrain data beneath every road, every ruin, every neon sign was laid over geological survey data from the real Nevada desert. The land is real. The graves are fictional, but the silence between them is the same. That silence is where these 201 facts live, and the desert has been waiting, without impatience, for someone to finally start listening. The Mojave does not announce itself. It simply begins. From the first moment the world loads, before the first line of narration is finished, before the first step is taken outside, the wasteland is already running. Systems are already active. Timers are already counting. The world was designed to feel like it existed before the story arrived. And in many ways, it did. One of the most recognized phrases in the entire Fallout series is spoken in the opening moments of New Vegas. The phrase is, "War never changes," delivered by narrator Ron Perlman in the same measured tone it has been delivered in since the original Fallout release in 1997. But in New Vegas, the phrase carries a different meaning than it did before. The wars of the earlier games were fought over survival, over water, over food, over the basic conditions of staying alive. The conflict at the center of New Vegas is not fought over survival at all. The NCR and Caesar's Legion are fighting over ownership, over who gets to control a region that both sides are willing to spend lives to possess. The Mojave was never a battlefield of desperation. It was always a battlefield of pride. And that single shift in what the war is about quietly changes what the phrase means the moment it is spoken. The Lucky 38 casino tower rises above the New Vegas Strip like a needle pressed into the desert sky. It is visible from nearly every outdoor location across the Mojave, and yet no other character in the wasteland ever looks at it. Residents of Freeside do not glance toward it. Traders passing beneath its shadow do not reference it in conversation. It stands at the center of the region's most contested territory, and the world around it behaves as though it simply is not there. This was partly a limitation of the systems that governed how characters processed their environments, but the effect it creates is something else entirely. The largest structure in the Mojave exists inside a kind of collective blindness, as though the wasteland had agreed, without speaking, to look everywhere except up. That same blindness extends to what lies on the ground. The dead of the Mojave do not disappear on a fixed schedule. In most open worlds, bodies are quietly removed after a period of time to preserve the sense that the world is moving forward. In New Vegas, many corpses remain exactly where they fell for the entire duration of a playthrough. A raider killed near Goodsprings in the opening hours may still be decomposing in the same position many real-time hours later. The desert preserves them. This was not a deliberate design choice made for atmosphere. It was a memory optimization decision, a technical solution to a technical problem. But the result was a world that felt less like a game and more like a crime scene. The bodies stayed because it was easier to leave them, and the wasteland became more honest because of it. Veronica Santangelo, a companion affiliated with the Brotherhood of Steel, carries a unique weapon called Pushy, a heavy, two-handed industrial fist. The name of the weapon is never explained in any terminal entry, any piece of dialogue, or any record found across the Mojave. It simply exists, attached to a woman whose entire personal story is about being forced out of the only family she has ever known. Whether the name was placed deliberately as a quiet reflection of her situation, or was chosen without that intention, has never been confirmed. The ambiguity does not weaken the detail, it deepens it. Some of the most carefully felt things in the wasteland are the ones that were never officially explained. The Brotherhood of Steel maintains a hidden bunker beneath the Mojave, sealed from the surface and stocked with energy weapons that cannot be found anywhere else in the region. Among those weapons are models whose audio, the sounds they produce when fired, was carried over from recordings made for Fallout 3, set thousands of miles away in the ruins of Washington, D.C. The sounds of weapons discharged in the capital wasteland were quietly placed inside weapons stored beneath the Mojave Desert. Those who explored the bunker and fired those weapons heard an echo from a different wasteland entirely, without ever knowing it. The distance between the two worlds collapsed into a single sound, and no one noticed. New Vegas Radio, hosted by the voice known as Mr. New Vegas, plays a fixed rotation of pre-war music across the Mojave. The rotation was not assembled at random. The songs were selected and sequenced to follow the emotional shape of a single day, lighter and more upbeat in the early hours of the loop, gradually shifting towards slower and more melancholy standards as the sequence moved into what the audio records describe as the late-night section. The Mojave was given an emotional schedule. The music was designed to feel like time passing, and for those who listened long enough without changing the station, the wasteland quietly moved through its moods like something alive. In Freeside, the slum district that sits just outside the New Vegas Strip, several residents were scripted with a behavior that has no parallel anywhere else in the wasteland. The daily schedules contain a block of time, sometimes as long as 6 in-game hours, labeled simply as sitting without purpose. They were not assigned tasks during this time. They were not waiting for a condition to be met. They were coded to exist without direction. This was not a glitch in their scheduling. The behavior was written deliberately. It was a design decision about what poverty looks like when it is translated into the language of artificial routines. The wasteland's most forgotten residents were given the most honest instruction: do nothing, because there is nothing to do. The Securitrons that patrol the New Vegas Strip carry 2 distinct faces. The first is the Mark I, a calm, authoritative police officer rendered on a circular screen. The second is the Mark II, a soldier, harder and more direct. When conditions in the wasteland shift and the upgrade is triggered, the change between these 2 faces is instantaneous. There is no transition. One moment, the screen shows calm. The next, it shows force. Those who witnessed the change while standing close to a Securitron often described it as unsettling in a way that was difficult to name, as though something in the machine's disposition had shifted without warning, without acknowledgement, and without any visible cause. The face simply changed, and the conversation continued. Benny, the man responsible for the act of violence that opens the story of New Vegas, was constructed to hold 2 qualities at the same time. He was designed to be charming enough that his motivations felt understandable, and transparent enough that his trustworthiness was never in question. Yet the choices available to those who encountered him were given equal weight. Forgiveness was scripted with the same care as confrontation. A quiet arrangement was treated with the same seriousness as open conflict. The wasteland did not judge any of these paths. It recorded them and moved forward. The moral indifference written into Benny's storyline reflects something larger: the idea that in the Mojave, outcomes matter more than the values that produce them. Caesar's Legion does not use pre-war currency. In its place, a silver coin bearing Caesar's likeness was adopted as the currency of the Legion's territory. The physical model used to create that coin in the Wasteland's records was based on a scan of an actual Roman denarius, a coin from the ancient world, more than 2,000 years old, taken from a personal collection and digitized for use in a fictional post-apocalyptic economy. The coin that circulates among Legion soldiers is, in terms of historical accuracy, one of the most precisely rendered objects in the entire Mojave. A fragment of genuine ancient history was sealed inside a work of fiction, and it sits there still, spending itself in a world that does not know what it is holding. At the southern edge of the Mojave stands the Mojave Outpost, a waypoint along the main route into the region. In its courtyard rises a monument: 2 NCR soldiers, cast in stone, their hands joined in a gesture of agreement. The statue was built to commemorate a treaty, but both soldier figures were constructed from the same base model. Reflected along a central axis, their surfaces mirrored so that each is the other in reverse. The 2 sides of the agreement are, visually, the same person. Whether this was a deliberate artistic statement about the nature of political agreements, or simply a decision made to save time during construction, was never confirmed. It reads, quietly, as both. Nuka-Cola Quartz and Nuka-Cola Victory are the 2 regional variants of the Mojave, one glowing white, one glowing orange. Their effects on the body are nearly the same, but the words printed on their labels are not. Quartz was marketed before the bombs fell as a product of purity, aimed at southern consumers. Victory was marketed as a celebration of westward expansion, sold to those who believed the frontier still had room to grow. Both bottles now sit in the ruins of a civilization that produced them. The marketing language remains perfectly intact. The people it was written for do not. The bombs did not change a single word on those labels. They simply removed everyone who was meant to read them. In the Mojave, the oldest things are not the ruins. They are the words printed on them, still trying to sell something to people who no longer exist. The desert does not rot. That is perhaps the most unsettling truth about the world of Fallout, New Vegas. 200 years have passed since the bombs fell, and yet the food is still on the shelves. The cans are still sealed. The labels are still readable. Something that should have turned to dust long ago is still sitting exactly where it was left, waiting with no particular urgency for someone to pick it up. The weight of things in the wasteland does not follow any logic that the old world would recognize. A Brahmin, the two-headed cattle that wander the desert and serve as the region's primary livestock, weighs approximately 1,400 pounds according to records left behind from before the war. And yet, when one of these animals dies, its body carries no weight at all. It becomes, in the physical accounting of the wasteland, nothing. A piece of Brahmin steak cut from that same animal, however, registers as a full pound of carried burden. The meat weighs more than the creature it came from. The body of the animal is treated as scenery. Its smallest edible fraction is treated as cargo. In the desert, death makes things lighter. Only what remains useful is allowed to have weight. Something similar is true of the most fought-over structure in the entire region. The Hoover Dam, the prize at the center of every faction's ambition, the object around which the fate of the West is said to turn, has no solid exterior in most of its outer faces. Those who approached the dam from outside its intended paths passed directly through its walls. The concrete did not stop them. The stone did not resist. The most important structure in the wasteland is, beneath its surface, a hollow shape. Factions have spent years and lives and resources trying to control something that, from certain angles, is not entirely there. It reminds us, quietly, that the things people fight hardest over are not always the things that can bear the weight of that fighting. Among the more overlooked details of the food that survived the bombs is a small line of text printed on every corner of Cram, the processed meat product that has appeared in every chapter of Fallout's history since the very beginning. The label on Cram reads, "Now with 30% more Cram." This line implies a previous version existed, a lesser Cram, a Cram that was found wanting and improved upon before the bombs fell. The upgraded formula is what survived. Whatever the original tasted like, it did not make it into the ruins. Only the better version endured. The desert kept the improvement and discarded the original without anyone asking it to. The fancy lads' snack cakes, small, cream-filled pastries found in boxes across the ruins, were very nearly removed from the finished version of New Vegas entirely. They were carried over from earlier Fallout records as placeholder items and were kept only because those who tested the world during its construction became attached to finding them. The nutritional information printed on every box lists the calorie count per serving as 420 calories. The serving size is listed as 1 cake. Each box contains 4 cakes. The company that produced them expected a person to open the box, eat 1/4 of a cake, and stop. The assumption was written seriously. It was printed on the label. It has survived 200 years without anyone meeting it. The stim pack, the small auto-injecting syringe that has served as the primary healing tool across the entire Fallout series, is described in its records as capable of repairing broken bones, damaged organs, and radiation exposure at the same time. A review of the chemical compounds listed in the official law documentation for the stim pack concluded that those same compounds, combined in the proportions described, would cause cardiac arrest within minutes of injection. The item designed to keep people alive is, by the chemistry printed in its own records, something that should end them. It heals by a logic that has nothing to do with medicine, and yet it works. In the wasteland, working is the only standard that matters. There is also the matter of Psycho, the combat drug carried by soldiers and raiders throughout the ruins. Its full designation, found in pre-war military records, was the Psychopathic Combat Enhancer. It was developed during the Resource Wars specifically to allow soldiers to carry out actions they would otherwise refuse. The drug was designed to reduce empathy, to make the refusal go away. The name was shortened to Psycho for practical use, and in the loading tips that appear between locations, the drug is recommended in the same calm, instructional tone used to describe every other survival tool. The Wasteland's official guidance suggests, without any particular concern, that suppressing conscience is a reasonable approach to a difficult situation. Nuka-Cola, the soft drink that has outlasted every government, every institution, and nearly every living thing, was confirmed in terminal records from the Commonwealth ruins to have contained trace amounts of radioactive strontium-90 in its formula before the bombs fell. The compound was placed there deliberately at at the request of the government to test radiation tolerance across the general population without their knowledge. Every family that gave a child a bottle of grape-flavored Nuka-Cola was participating in an experiment they had not agreed to. The experiment had no end date. The results were never published. The flavor remained grape. Children in the ruins of New Vegas exist outside the physical rules that govern everything else. They cannot be harmed, not because they are protected by any structure or any person, but because the systems that govern damage simply do not register when directed at them. A weapon discharged in their direction produces no effect and no acknowledgement. The action is recorded nowhere. In the physical world of the desert, a child is more structurally stable than a concrete wall, more resistant than sealed steel, more permanent than almost anything else that exists in the ruins. The wasteland is a place where children cannot be touched. It is one of the only such places left. The platinum chip, the small data storage device at the center of the main story, weighs nothing. It cannot be dropped, traded, or destroyed through any standard means. It is sealed into the records of whoever carries it. And yet, there exists a specific and obscure sequence of events involving a particular personality trait and a companion dismissal at a precise moment that causes a second copy of the chip to appear. One copy remains in the inventory. The other floats in the air at the point of separation. Two versions of the same indestructible object existing at the same time, in the same space. The system that governs the world cannot process this. It stops. The most important object in the desert breaks reality simply by being counted twice. Victor, the Securitron who first appeared in Goodsprings with a cowboy's face and a friendly, unhurried voice, was later revealed to be operated remotely by Mr. House from within the Lucky 38. But two of Victor's dialogue responses in Goodsprings do not match the speech patterns found anywhere else in Mr. House's recorded communications. The sentences are shorter. The phrasing is warmer. They read as though written for a Victor who was present in the conversation, rather than receiving instructions from a distance. Whether these lines survived from an earlier version of the character, or whether they were placed deliberately to suggest something developing inside the machine, was never clarified. The lines were never corrected. They remain in the record, quiet and unaccounted for. The Protectrons, slow, boxy security robots found throughout the ruins, carry a loyalty designation buried in their base records. The designation reads, US Government, Primary. This means that every Protectron still standing in the desert is coded to place the orders of the United States government above all other instructions. The government has not existed for 200 years. No one holds its authority. No one can transmit its commands. And yet the robots wait. They are loyal to a sender who will never send anything again. The loyalty was written into them before the war and has never been updated. It simply runs, continuously, attached to nothing. The terminals found throughout the ruins hold thousands of pieces of pre-war correspondence. Letters between soldiers, messages between co-workers, notes between people who expected to send more. At the military base near Searchlight, a chain of 3 messages sits in an unread folder. The first asks about reassignment orders. The second asks again. The third contains only 2 words, still waiting. The chain ends there. The person who wrote those words never received a reply. The message has been sitting in that terminal for 200 years. It is still marked as unread. In the desert, patience is not a virtue. It is simply what remains when everything else has been taken away. The Deathclaw, the largest and most feared creature in the open desert, has an animation buried in its behavioral records that almost no one has ever seen. Roughly once every 45 minutes of time passing in the world, the creature pauses. It lifts its head. It holds completely still for approximately 8 seconds. Then it continues as though nothing happened. The animation was not connected to any trigger. It was not built into any behavioral system. It exists in the records without explanation. Something in the design of this creature, built entirely for violence, built entirely for killing, was given a moment of stillness. What the stillness was meant to represent was never recorded. And then there are the graves outside Nipton. They do not announce themselves. They appear as slight changes in the soil, darker patches, uneven ground, lines in the earth that do not match the surrounding terrain. Those who passed through the area before reaching the town walked over them without knowing what they were. The evidence of what Caesar's legion had done was placed in the ground before the story explained it. The ground was disturbed before the context arrived. And once the truth became clear, the image of that soil could not be unseen. The wasteland had shown its wound before it explained how it was made. The desert is full of things that outlasted their purpose. Food that feeds no one, messages that reached no one, graves that were dug before anyone knew to mourn. Those graves outside Nipton point inward. They point toward the town and toward the organization that made the town into what it became. Caesar's legion is often described as the simplest kind of evil, brutal, loud, and easy to dismiss. But the details buried inside its history suggest something more uncomfortable than simple cruelty. They suggest a system with rules, with logic, with a philosophy that was constructed carefully by a person who believed he was correcting the mistakes of history. Caesar's legion was not built by a warlord. It was built by a scholar. Edward Sallow was a former citizen of the NCR, trained as a linguist and deeply familiar with the written records of the Old World. His obsession settled on a single text, the historian Edward Gibbon's account of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Sallow did not read that book as a tribute to Rome's greatness. He read it as a diagnosis of Rome's failure. Every weakness Gibbon identified, every structural flaw that Sallow believed had brought the empire down, became something to be engineered out of his own design. The legion was not built to celebrate what Rome was. It was built to survive what Rome could not. The entire faction is the work of a man who believed history had given him a blueprint for avoiding catastrophe, and who was willing to build that blueprint out of human lives. The salute used by legion soldiers, right arm extended, palm facing downward, was adopted as a direct reference to what Sallow called Roman tradition. But the gesture was not Roman at all. Historians had largely concluded, even before the bombs fell, that the so-called Roman salute was invented in the 19th century by European painters who imagined ancient Rome in ways that suited their own aesthetic preferences. The gesture was later adopted by political movements in the 20th century, with no connection to Rome whatsoever. Caesar, the trained linguist who built his entire civilization on historical accuracy, constructed its most visible daily ritual around a fabrication. The salute performed by every legion soldier is a misquote. The society built on Rome was built, in part, on something Rome never did. The military structure of the legion does not match the Roman model it claims to follow. Centurions hold authority, but that authority is not granted through appointment or inheritance. It is earned through personal combat. The most decorated soldiers in the legion are not strategists or administrators. They are fighters who survived more violence than those around them. In the actual Roman army, such men would not have held officer ranks. They would have been placed in arenas for the entertainment of the people who held power. The legion's highest ranks are filled with men who, in the civilization they claim to descend from, would have been gladiators. The hierarchy built on Roman principles is, by Roman standards, a hierarchy of spectacle. Beneath Caesar's tent at the fort, his main encampment on Fortification Hill, there is a sealed underground structure. It is a pre-war missile silo, still intact, being used by the legion for storage. Caesar is aware of what it is. He uses it anyway. The legion's stated philosophy rejects the technology and the institutions of the old world entirely. Caesar speaks of transcendence, of building something new on the ruins of what failed. And yet the infrastructure of that failure sits directly beneath the place where he sleeps. The weapons that would most clearly demonstrate his dependence on what he claims to have left behind are stored in a room underneath his own camp. The contradiction was not hidden. It was simply placed where most people would not think to look. The town of Nipton was, before the legion arrived, conducting a quiet arrangement with both major factions simultaneously. Its mayor, Joseph Stein, was accepting payment from the NCR to allow their supplies through, and payment from the legion to allow their movements to go unreported. When the legion discovered this arrangement, they did not simply execute those responsible. They held a lottery. The residents of the town were gathered and assigned outcomes by chance. Some received slavery. Some received crippling injuries. Some received crucifixion. The lottery was not designed as punishment. It was designed as theatre. The legion forced the town to watch its own destruction unfold in stages, with the randomness of the outcome ensuring that no one could feel their suffering was earned or avoided through anything they had done. Control, in the legion's philosophy, is most complete when it cannot be predicted or bargained with. Legate Lanius commands the legion's military forces from behind a mask that, according to the records describing it, has been fused to his face following damage sustained in battle. The face beneath the mask has not been seen by anyone in the Legion for years. In the final confrontation at Hoover Dam, Lanius can be persuaded to withdraw his forces through conversation alone. One of the arguments that succeeds is the suggestion that he fears what the Legion would do to him if he were seen to retreat. The most feared soldier in the region, the man whose reputation is built entirely on the certainty of his violence, can be stopped by pointing out that he is afraid. The fear that controls everyone beneath him also controls him. It simply wears a different face. The Legion's most effective spy operates under the name Vulpes Inculta. In Latin, Vulpes means fox. His name, translated directly, is Fox, the same word repeated twice. He wears a fox pelt on his head. Whether this repetition was placed as an internal reference to the absurdity of a man who names himself after his own disguise, or whether it was simply a name chosen for sound rather than meaning, was never confirmed. What is clear is that the fox is not a threatening symbol. It is small. It is clever. It survives through indirection rather than force. The Legion's most dangerous operative chose, as his symbol, a creature whose survival strategy has nothing to do with strength. The White Glove Society operates the Ultralux Casino on the Strip and presents itself as the most refined organization in the region. Its members wear blank white masks at all times. Their records reveal that the society had, at some point in its history, practiced cannibalism and had subsequently reformed. The reform was announced publicly. The masks were introduced at the same time. Further records make clear that the reform was not genuine. The cannibalism continued after the announcement. The masks were not adopted to mark a change in behavior. They were adopted to cover the fact that no change had occurred. The most recognizable feature of the White Glove Society was designed on the same day the killing went underground. The slave population held within Legion territory is estimated in the spoken records of those who have seen it to number in the tens of thousands. Legion scribes do not record slaves by name. They are assigned numbers. Those who escaped Legion control and were encountered in the ruins still identified themselves by their assigned numbers long after their escape, months later, sometimes years. The spoken records of those encounters do not include any moment where someone was able to give a former slave their name back. The thing that was taken was not something that could be returned through conversation. The wasteland offered escape. It did not offer restoration. At Ranger Station, Charlie, the NCR maintains prisoner records organized by a threat classification system ranging from 1 to 5. In one terminal, a prisoner is listed under the designation Class 0. That classification appears nowhere in any official NCR documentation found elsewhere in the region. No explanation is offered for what it means. The prisoner associated with the label is listed as deceased upon arrival. The NCR created a category that does not officially exist, assigned it to a person, and recorded that person as dead. The unnamed classification sits in the record without context, attached to someone who never had the chance to ask what it meant. The official casualty count from the First Battle of Hoover Dam, recorded in NCR military reports at Camp McCarran, lists 121 soldiers lost. Civilian accounts gathered by researchers affiliated with the Followers of the Apocalypse, the humanitarian organization that operates medical clinics throughout the region, place that number above 900. Both figures exist in the same world. Neither is challenged by any authority within it. The gap between them is documented and then left alone. The game does not resolve the contradiction. It simply holds both numbers at the same time and allows them to mean whatever the reader decides they mean. The Followers of the Apocalypse maintain a medical clinic inside the Old Mormon Fort in Freeside. Their terminal records contain entries for over 300 named patients, each with a recorded symptom, a treatment, and an outcome. Of those 300 entries, exactly 6 connect to anything else in the wider story of the region. The remaining 294 are complete. They're detailed. They're attached to no further record anywhere in the wasteland. The Followers documented those people carefully and thoroughly. The world around them decided those people did not need to be remembered for any other purpose. The records exist. The stories attached to them do not. The Great Khans, the raider group that traces its lineage back through Fallout 1 and Fallout 2, have been nearly destroyed by the NCR on 2 separate occasions across their history. Papa Khan, their current leader, is the 3rd man to hold that title. He's aware of what the NCR did. He carries that history. And he is in active negotiation with Caesar's Legion, an organization whose treatment of absorbed groups leaves nothing of what those groups were before. He describes this as pragmatism. The Khans have survived long enough to know exactly what alliances with larger powers cost them. They are considering another one anyway. Some patterns in the wasteland repeat not because no one recognizes them, but because recognition is not enough to stop them. Arcade Gannon works as a doctor for the followers of the apocalypse in Freeside. He is careful, competent, and quietly funny, in a way that suggests the humor has been practiced over a long time. His father was an officer of the Enclave, the organization responsible for some of the most deliberate suffering inflicted on the wasteland's population after the war. Arcade knows this. He chose medicine. He chose the followers. He chose to spend his life attempting to repair, one patient at a time, a fraction of the damage his father's organization helped create. When the subject of his past comes up, he makes a joke. The joke lands. It is also, clearly, a door being closed. Every faction in the desert carries the damage of who built it, and what they refused to become, and what they became anyway, without noticing. The damage runs deepest underground. Above the ruins, factions argue over dams and roads and the right to call themselves civilization. Below the surface, something quieter was always running. The vaults were presented to the people who entered them as shelter, as the one decision that would keep them and their families alive when everything above them ended. They were not shelter. They were something else entirely. And the details of what they were, examined one by one, are among the most disturbing records left behind in the ruins of the old world. Vault 21 was built directly beneath the strip, sealed underground while the city above it was still lit with neon and noise. Its governing rule was simple. Every dispute between residents, no matter how small, was to be resolved by gambling. Sleeping arrangements, food distribution, leadership positions, all of it was decided by chance. The experiment was designed to measure whether a society governed entirely by probability could hold itself together over time. It could not. By the time the vault was forced open, its population had collapsed into a small group of people who had spent decades losing everything to each other and starting again. The city above them was built on gambling. The vault beneath it was destroyed by the same principle. The experiment produced exactly the population that the strip was designed to welcome. Vault 11, located in the desert south of Boulder City, was built around a different kind of demand. Each year, the vault's automated systems required its residents to select one of their own and deliver that person to a designated chamber. If the selection was made, the rest of the population was allowed to continue. If it was refused, the systems were programmed to execute everyone. The records buried in the vault's terminals reveal that the sacrifice itself was not the focus of the experiment. The question Vault-Tec was measuring was simpler and more terrible. How long before the residents refuse? The answer, documented across multiple generations of vault inhabitants, was a very long time. The refusal, when it finally came, killed nearly everyone inside. The people who survived were the ones who said no first. It remains unclear whether Vault-Tec considered that outcome a success or a failure. Vault 19 was divided from the beginning. Its residents were separated into two groups, one housed in a red-coded section, one in a blue-coded section, with no explanation given for the division. Over time, the conditions in the two sections were made subtly different. The red section received slightly less light, slightly smaller food portions, slightly higher temperatures. The differences were small enough that no single one could be identified as a cause. But the experiment was designed to measure whether manufactured disadvantage, inequality built into the environment rather than into any stated policy, could produce genuine hostility between people who had no prior reason to hate each other. It could. Within a generation, the two groups were in open conflict. The environmental differences had been removed long before the violence began. The hostility no longer needed a cause. It had become self-sustaining. Vault 34 was stocked with weapons. Large quantities of them distributed throughout the facility with ammunition to match. Its population was set below the vault's intended capacity, which meant that as time passed and resources declined, the weapons became more valuable than the food. The terminal records from inside the vault described the result in careful administrative language. 3 armed groups, a standoff that could not be resolved, and an accidental breach of the reactor that irradiated most of the population before any faction achieved control. The vault's lockdown system, designed to contain violence by sealing off sections of the facility, activated during the breach. It sealed the irradiated survivors inside. The system built to prevent catastrophe became the mechanism that ensured no one could escape it. Vault 22 was described to its residents as a food production study. They were told they would be working on agricultural experiments, developing new methods of growing food in sealed environments. This was not false. The agricultural experiments were real. What was not disclosed was the nature of the organism introduced into the vault's air filtration system, a fungal strain designated the Beauvarissin strain, developed by Vault-Tec's agricultural division and designed to colonize human nervous tissue. Within 2 years of the vault's sealing, the fungus had established itself throughout the population. Residents died. Their bodies continued to move. The growth inside them directed that movement for up to 6 months after death. Vault-Tec's internal assessment of the experiment described it as a partial success. The definition of success being applied had nothing to do with the welfare of the people inside. The records left behind by Vault-Tec, found across the ruins of multiple regions and referenced in the documents uncovered during the events depicted in the Fallout television series, reveal that the Vault program was never designed to preserve human life. The vaults were designed to generate data on how people behave under conditions of extreme stress, enforced isolation, resource scarcity, and social manipulation. Vault-Tec intended to use this data to construct the post-war society they planned to govern from a separate facility, one that Vault residents were never told existed. The vaults were not built as lifeboats. They were built as laboratories, with their walls painted to look like lifeboats. Every person who entered one, believing they were being saved, was, from the moment the door sealed, a research subject. The overseer of each vault, the authority figure placed in charge of the population, was not, in most cases, chosen by the residents. The overseer was a Vault-Tec employee, placed inside before the sealing and given a separate set of instructions stored in a terminal inaccessible to the general population. Those instructions described the true parameters of the experiment. They specified which behaviors to encourage, which tensions to allow to develop, and in some cases, at what point to introduce additional stressors artificially. The overseer was not a leader selected to serve the people in their care. The overseer was a researcher whose subjects had no idea they were being studied. Above ground, authority conducted itself differently, but not always more honestly. President Kimball of the NCR delivered a public address at Hoover Dam, filled with language about democracy, expansion, and the promise of a stable future. The speech was prepared by a propaganda office. Companions who were present during the address noted quietly, in their own spoken records, that several of the historical claims in the speech were inaccurate. The crowd cheered. The inaccuracies were not corrected. The game recorded both the speech and the corrections and placed them side by side without comment. The political theatre and the quiet fact-checking existed in the same moment, and the theatre continued regardless. Inside the Tops Casino on the Strip, a performer named Hadrian sang pre-war songs every evening in the lounge. His contract, stored in a backstage terminal, contained a specific clause. He was not permitted to perform any song that referenced nuclear conflict, political collapse, or death. 23 titles were listed as prohibited. The remaining approved material consisted entirely of love songs and novelty numbers. The Tops was a place where grief had been made contractually impossible. The suppression of difficult music was not incidental to the casino's atmosphere. It was written into an employment agreement and enforced as policy. Forgetting was not encouraged. It was required. Vault 11's terminal records are among the most complete Vault documentation found anywhere in the region. They were formatted by Vault-Tec to reflect the perspective of the Vault's management. The personal records of non-management residents, journals, letters, private accounts of daily life were digitized and filed in a subfolder labeled Non-Essential Personnel Records. The folder contains 847 entries. None of them are connected to any wider record of events in the region. Those who read through them find a complete social history of the Vault, written by the people Vault-Tec classified as not worth cataloguing officially. The label non-essential was applied to the records of the people whose suffering was the entire point of the experiment. In the flooded lower levels of Vault 34, a personal diary was left behind. It was written by a woman named Selma over 34 days following the reactor breach. The diary does not describe the political situation inside the vault or the conflict between factions. It describes the sound the rising water made against the walls, the color the overhead lights turned as the power began to fail, the temperature of the floor beneath her hands. The last entry ends in the middle of a sentence on day 34. Selma's remains were found approximately 40 feet from where the diary was left. She was moving toward the exit when the diary stopped. The tribe known as the Boomers, who occupy Nellis Air Force Base north of the city, are descended from residents of Vault 34 who escaped before the reactor breach. They carried weapons with them when they left. They also carried something less visible, a set of beliefs instilled across generations inside the vault, that the world outside was dangerous and that outsiders could not be trusted. When they emerged, they fired on everyone who approached. The belief that the outside world was a threat became true because they made it true. Every attack on approaching strangers confirmed what they had been taught. The conditioning did not need the vault to continue. It had already been built into the people who carried it out into the open. The Courier, the figure at the center of the story, arrived in Goodsprings, already marked by a history the game never explains. The doctor who treated the injuries from the shooting noted pre-existing scar tissue, healed fractures, and signs of prior head trauma. The Courier had survived serious harm before the events of New Vegas began. What that harm was, where it occurred, and what it meant are questions the game declines to answer. The character's body carries evidence of a past that was deliberately withheld. The history was placed there and then sealed away, like a vault within a vault. The Great War, the event that ended the old world and made everything in the ruins possible, has no explained cause in any official record found across the wasteland. The bombs fell on a specific day, in a specific sequence, and no surviving document explains why that day was chosen. Records uncovered during the events depicted in the first season of the Fallout television series suggest that Vault-Tec may have possessed prior knowledge of the timing, possibly more than knowledge. If that implication is accurate, then every experiment conducted inside every vault was not a response to a catastrophe that happened. It was a step in a plan that the catastrophe was written into from the beginning. The question that remains unanswered is not what happened. It is who decided when. The vaults were sealed from the outside, and what was sealed inside them was not humanity's last hope, but someone's longest experiment running still. Above the vaults, something else was always running. While the experiments below played out across generations, a single man in a sealed tower was running his own kind of experiment, quieter, more patient, and in some ways more disturbing than anything Vault-Tec had designed. Mr. House did not need a vault. He built something better. He built a plan that could outlast the war, outlast the factions, and outlast the biological limitations of the body he was born into. The details of how he did it, examined carefully, reveal a person whose greatest strengths and deepest failures were constructed from exactly the same material. Robert Edwin House was born on June 25th, 2020. At the time of the events in New Vegas, he was 261 years old. He was not a ghoul. Radiation had not preserved him. What preserved him was preparation. A life support pod of his own design. A cerebral interface that allowed him to operate the systems of the Lucky 38 remotely. And a private stockpile of medical technology that his own terminal records indicate required 43 years of continuous adjustment and refinement between the end of the war and the present day. He spent 43 years correcting the errors in his own survival systems. Most people in the ruins spent those same years trying to find food. House spent them debugging his own body's relationship to time. While sealed inside that pod, House operated a network of 47 Securitron units across the strip through a direct neural connection. Over one 11-year period documented in his maintenance logs, he made more than 12,000 individual decisions about Securitron behavior and deployment without once leaving the pod. He governed the strip in complete isolation for over a century. His records from that period contain a category labeled social interaction with a running total beside it. The total reads 0. The category was created, tracked, and maintained across decades. It simply accumulated nothing. He considered it worth measuring. He did not consider it worth pursuing. The three tribes recruited to staff the strip's casinos, the chairman, the omertas, and the White Glove Society, were each required to undergo a process House referred to in his records as cultural refinement. Tribal artifacts were destroyed, names were changed, dress codes were adopted. In some cases, physical alterations were made to remove identifying features. The tribes received security and resources in exchange. House's records describe the outcome of this process using the word civilizing. The records contain detailed entries about what each tribe was required to give up. They contain no entries from any tribe member describing how the process felt. The documentation is complete on one side and entirely absent on the other. House's records contain one word that appears nowhere else in his logs when referring to any other person or organization. That word is partner. It appears exactly twice, both times in reference to the Courier. Each instance is immediately followed by a clause beginning with the words provided that. The partnership was real in House's accounting. It was also conditional. The word was chosen with the same care he applied to every other decision in his records. It represented, in the vocabulary of a man who categorized human relationships as assets and risk variables, the closest available approximation of something he did not have a more precise term for. Every casino on the Strip operated with a mathematical adjustment applied to its games, a hidden modifier that altered the odds without being disclosed to those playing. This is a standard feature of real-world gambling establishments. What was not standard was that House applied the same principle to conversation. The persuasion systems used when negotiating directly with him were weighted to make success slightly less likely than the same negotiation would be with any other figure in the region. He built a rhetorical advantage into his own dialogue. The House edge was not limited to the casino floor. It extended to every exchange he was part of. The luck statistic, which governs gambling outcomes, critical strike probability, and certain conversational results, has a secondary effect when applied specifically to interactions with House's casino systems. Those with the highest possible luck rating lose to his tables at exactly the same rate as those with the lowest. House's systems were written to override the modifier entirely. Cosmic fortune, as measured by the Wasteland's accounting, was not an exception he was willing to make. Chance was a variable. Variables were things to be controlled. He did not leave room for the universe to intervene on behalf of someone he had already calculated for. House's plan, the one he had been running since before the bombs fell, was built on a 300-year timeline. By the game's present of 2281, he projected that the Strip's income and his Securitron forces would be sufficient to fund and protect a space program capable of reaching a habitable planet within a human lifetime. He calculated this before the war. The war came and went. The timeline continued. 2 centuries of catastrophe, faction conflict, and slow decay passed around him, while he maintained the same projection he had set before any of it happened. The plan had outlasted the civilization that made it, the government that governed the land it was built on, and every other institution that had ever held authority in the region. In Freeside, a group known as the Kings had been operating a school of behavioral and aesthetic instruction for 30 years. The leader had held his position for 16 of those years. In that time, he personally trained more than 200 members in what he called the King's Way, a philosophy of personal loyalty and individual style assembled from a single pre-war educational film found in a burned-out building. The film featured a musician named Elvis Presley. The King built a functioning social institution, a code of conduct, and a community identity from a piece of media he found in rubble. The philosophy was genuine. The source was an instructional video. In the ruins, meaning is constructed from whatever is still intact enough to hold it. The followers of the Apocalypse, the humanitarian organization operating medical clinics throughout the region, traced their origins to a group of academics and librarians who sealed themselves inside the Los Angeles Central Library before the bombs fell. They refused to leave until they had copied every accessible text onto materials that could survive the conditions they expected to follow. The founding document of the organization, referenced in records found in New Vegas, is not a set of principles or a statement of purpose. It is a list of books. The most consistently compassionate faction in the Wasteland was founded on an act of cataloging. The legal basis for House's ownership of the Strip was established before the war through a series of land trusts and corporate structures registered under Nevada state law. His lawyers filed the paperwork. The filings were valid. House did not take the Strip when he had the power to do so. He had purchased it through legal mechanisms decades before the war and had been its rightful owner ever since. The legal framework that established that ownership no longer has a court to enforce it. House maintained the paperwork regardless. He intended, apparently, to honor the transaction, whether or not any institution remained that could require him to. The NCR maintains administrative records of settlements throughout the region. A census, updated every 5 years by traveling scribes, lists Goodsprings as having 47 residents. The actual number of residents present in Goodsprings at the time of the game's events is 23. The census is 5 years out of date. The missing 24 people are not accounted for in any follow-up record. No inquiry was sent. No updated count was commissioned. The NCR's bureaucratic process continued to operate with the wrong numbers, because the process itself had no mechanism for noticing that the numbers were wrong. The record was maintained. The reality it described had moved on without it. The Securitrons that patrol the Strip run on a behavioral programming suite last updated in 2065. 16 years before the Great War ended the world they were built for. Their threat assessment systems, their social response scripts, and their customer interaction protocols were all written for a Las Vegas that no longer exists, in a world that no longer operates by the assumptions built into their code. When a Securitron offers a polite greeting to someone passing through the strip, it is executing a subroutine designed for tourists visiting a functioning city. The politeness is technically genuine. Everything it was designed to mean dissolved 200 years ago. The words remain. Their world did not. Mr. House built a future out of mathematics, patience, and the refusal to believe that the world's ending had changed what was possible. And the most disturbing thing is that he may not have been wrong. While House planned across centuries, others in the ruins were planning much shorter distances ahead. The next meal, the next safe place to sleep, the next transaction that might keep them alive for another few days. These smaller stories do not appear in the official records of factions or the strategic reports of military commands. They exist in the margins, in the details attached to characters that the wider story moves past without slowing down. And in those margins, the wasteland reveals something that the main quest rarely has time to say directly. Boxcars was a member of the Powder Gangers, a faction of escaped convicts operating in the southern reaches of the region. When the Legion came through Nipton, Boxcars ran. As punishment for fleeing, both of his legs were broken, and he was left at the Nipton Road rest stop, unable to stand or walk. He asked anyone who passed for Psycho not to use as a weapon, but to manage the pain of bones that had never been set. A person with sufficient medical knowledge could set those bones without any tools beyond their own hands. There was no reward attached to doing so. No standing improved, no resource gained, no further interaction unlocked. Boxcars said thank you and remained sitting in the ruins. The choice to help him existed entirely outside the logic of benefit. It was placed there quietly, attached to a character the wider story had already forgotten. Sunny Smiles introduced herself in Goodsprings as a guide, someone familiar with the surrounding terrain who could show a newcomer how to handle the creatures and dangers nearby. During that early period, she could not be harmed. Any attack directed at her produced no effect. She was protected by a designation that marked her as essential to the story at that stage. That designation was removed once her purpose in the opening hours was complete. From that point forward, she could be killed by anything the region might send her way: a wandering predator, a raider, a stray shot from a passing conflict. Most people who passed through Goodsprings never returned. Sunny Smiles almost certainly died at some point in their absence. The protection that kept her alive lasted exactly as long as she was being watched. On the road between Novak and Boulder City, a traveling merchant named Samuel carried a letter in his coat. The letter was not referenced in any conversation he was willing to have. Accessing it required either taking it from him without permission or waiting until he could no longer object. The letter was addressed to a woman named Clara and described a meeting Samuel was planning in the city, one he was clearly looking forward to. The date listed in the letter for that meeting had already passed by 3 weeks, by the time any traveler encountered him on the road. He was still moving toward it. The meeting was already over, he did not know. The Mojave Express, the courier service that employed the courier before the events of the story, maintained an active delivery ledger in its Prim office. The ledger listed all current assignments. The platinum chip, the delivery at the center of everything that followed, was listed as item 6. The 5 entries above it described other deliveries, other couriers, other destinations. One of those entries was marked as failed due to the death of the courier assigned to it. The company had continued operating and scheduling new runs after losing a worker. The chip was not the only delivery on the manifest that had turned dangerous. It was simply the one the story chose to follow. In Prim, an abandoned house contained a kitchen that had been set with some care before it was left. The table was arranged with chairs pulled out, candles placed, food set out as though a meal was about to begin. The food had no nutritional value. It was a fixed object, placed there by someone building the environment rather than the story. No record in the house explained what had happened to the people who set the table. No quest referenced the location. The family had either left quickly or had been taken from a situation that had allowed them to set the table first. The game offered no way to determine which. The table remained set for the duration of the story, waiting for people who did not come back. Not far from the Colorado River, a ranger station stood with its equipment in working order. The water purifier was running. The bedrolls were arranged. The cooking setup had been left ready for use. The last entry in the station's terminal described a routine rotation rangers returning to base, planning to come back. The station showed no signs of conflict. No evidence of struggle had been left behind. The rangers had simply not returned. The absence of violence was, in this case, the most unsettling detail. Wreckage would have suggested a cause. The undisturbed equipment suggested nothing at all. The station filtered water into a container that had long since stopped being collected. In the captured town of Nelson, the Legion had crucified NCR soldiers at the entrance. One of them, a man named Private Jeremy Watson, was still alive when travelers arrived. He could be helped toward a quicker end or left where he was. If left, a timer began running in the background of the world, set to end somewhere between 12 and 36 hours of elapsed time, depending on a random determination made at the moment the choice was recorded. The exact moment of his death was tracked in a hidden variable. No record anywhere in the region noted it. No other character reacted to it. The timer ran, reached its end, and the variable was updated. The world continued exactly as before. The tracking existed anyway. Buried in the audio records of the region is an emergency broadcast that was written, recorded, and prepared for release during crisis points in the main story. It was designed to interrupt regular radio programming with a static-filled announcement and then cut out. The trigger conditions for its release were written into the code. The audio file was completed. And then, during the final stages of preparation, the broadcast was silenced. The triggers were disabled. The file remained in the records, attached to conditions that would never activate it. An emergency signal designed to reach everyone in the region was suppressed before the region ever heard it. Its silence left no mark on anything that followed. The records of the region also contained traces of a character who was removed before the story was completed. Rose of Sharon Cassidy, known as Cass, was written, in an earlier version of her story, to have a daughter. The child, designated Cass Jr., was written as having been left in the care of a traveling merchant while Cass worked. The character was removed entirely. Cass's spoken records contain no reference to her. The storyline attached to the relationship was cut. One line survived the removal, a line written for a situation that no longer existed in the final version. The line said that there were people depending on her that the listener would never meet. The people were gone. The line remained. Raul Tejada worked as a mechanic at a radio tower called Black Mountain before being found and freed. He was a ghoul, one of the humans, whose exposure to radiation had altered their biology in ways that extended their lifespan far beyond normal limits. Raul was more than 230 years old. He had been alive in Mexico City before the bombs fell. He remembered food that no one alive had tasted. He had known people whose grandchildren had since lived and died of old age. When he made a quiet, dry observation about the state of the world, he was drawing on 2 centuries of material. The humor was earned. The weariness behind it was older than anyone around him could fully account for. The memory loss sustained by the Courier from the shooting was specific in its nature. Skills were retained. Practical knowledge remained intact. Combat training, medical awareness, language, none of these were affected. What was lost was the narrative layer, names, relationships, the particular content of the assignment being carried out at the time of the injury. This pattern matches a documented category of traumatic brain injury, in which procedural memory, the kind that stores how to do things, is preserved while episodic memory, the kind that stores what happened, is damaged. The medical accuracy of this distinction was not accidental. It was verified during the design of the character. The amnesia was built to be real. The cazador, a large mutant wasp found throughout the open terrain, was described in its records as delivering a venom that caused progressive neurological degradation, leading to paralysis and then seizure. The description of that venom was written with reference to documented research on the tarantula hawk wasp, a real insect whose sting has been rated by entomologists as among the most intensely painful produced by any creature on Earth. The person who wrote the creature's records read the scientific literature before writing the description. The result was a fictional monster whose danger was grounded in something real. The cazador is terrifying for reasons that exist outside the fiction. The Night Stalker, a hybrid creature combining coyote and rattlesnake traits, produced through genetic research at the facility known as Big MT, displayed a specific behavioral response when a member of its pack was killed. Rather than fleeing, the remaining members circled the threat at increasing distance for up to 90 seconds before attacking again. This behavior was modeled on pack coordination patterns observed in wolves, an animal from an entirely different ecological context than either of the species used to create the Night Stalker. The creature was built from two animals. Its behavior was borrowed from a third. It was artificial in every layer of its existence. Veronica's story ended differently depending on choices made throughout her time as a companion. In the outcome, where the Brotherhood of Steel refused to change and remained sealed in isolation, she delivered a final statement in a voice that did not rise or fall. She said, quietly, that she did not know how to stop caring about something that was in the process of ending. The delivery was directed to be flat, as though the feeling had grown too large for any particular tone to contain it. The absence of inflection was not a failure of the performance. It was the performance. The most honest moment in her story was the one where her voice stopped trying to carry what it was saying. The ruins are full of people holding on to things they have no practical reason to keep, loyalty to causes that have stopped moving, love for people and places that are disappearing, hope aimed at directions that have not been confirmed to exist. The desert carries sound differently than other places. In open terrain, with little to absorb or redirect it, sound travels farther and arrives in ways that are harder to locate. The world of New Vegas was built with this in mind. Its acoustic design was not assembled casually. The sounds placed throughout the region in its streets, its ruins, its radio signals, its silences were constructed with the same deliberate attention given to its visual design. And in many cases, what was placed in the audio was never meant to be consciously noticed at all. The ambient sound surrounding the strip's exterior was built from 3 separate layers, recorded and mixed together. The first was a recording made on an actual casino floor in Las Vegas in 1998. The second was a synthesized crowd loop created specifically for the game. The third was a low-frequency hum described by the sound designer, responsible for it as a tone placed just below the threshold of conscious attention. The hum was not meant to be heard in the way a voice or a melody is heard. It was designed to be felt as a kind of pressure, present and sourceless, without the listener being able to identify where it was coming from. The strip's exterior was designed to make those who stood in it mildly uneasy without giving them a reason they could name. Beneath the sound of explosions in the region, a similar principle was applied. The audio built for mine detonations was layered from 3 components: a real military detonation recording, a low resonant boom added during production, and a third element that was never intended to be consciously audible: a human vocal sample, recorded and then reversed and pitched down by 2 octaves, was embedded inside every mine blast in the game. At normal listening volume, it cannot be separated from the rest of the sound. It was placed there, according to the records describing it, to give the explosion what the sound team called emotional weight. A reversed human sound is buried inside every detonation. The weight is real. Its source remains hidden. The voices of the protectrons, the boxy, slow-moving security units found throughout the region, were not recorded by a voice actor. They were produced using a text-to-speech system from the early 2000s, already considered outdated at the time the game was completed. The choice was deliberate. The sound team determined that no human voice performance could replicate the specific quality of synthetic speech they were looking for. A particular creakiness that belonged to software aging out of relevance. A pre-war robot running pre-war code would have sounded like this. The obsolescence of the tool was the point of using it. The outdated system produced the most accurate result. Hidden within the signal broadcast by the region's ambient radio band, the channel not associated with the voice of Mr. New Vegas is a pattern that repeats every 73 minutes. Those who recorded the broadcast and slowed it down discovered a Morse code sequence embedded in the transmission. The sequence was decoded and found to translate to a set of geographic coordinates. The coordinates correspond to a real location in the Nevada desert. Nothing of particular note exists at that location. The sound designers responsible for the broadcast have never commented on its presence. The coordinates were placed there with intention. What they were meant to indicate has not been explained. The audio present during loading transitions between areas of the game was not designed to be noticed. Most attention during these transitions was directed toward the text displayed on screen, but the hum present during loading varied in pitch depending on the destination. Interior vault locations loaded with a slightly higher pitch than exterior areas. The destination known as the Divide, the shattered landscape at the center of the Lonesome Road expansion, loaded with a hum that reached the lowest pitch of any location in the game. Whether this variation was engineered to create an unconscious emotional preparation for the environment being entered, or whether it was a technical artifact that was retained rather than corrected, was never confirmed. The Divide sounded different before it was seen. The opening of the Lonesome Road expansion included a sound during the initial monologue that cannot be located in the game's audio file directory. Those who extracted and analyzed the scene's audio described it as resembling distant wind, combined with something that sounded like a slow human exhale slowed to approximately 1/3 its natural speed. The sound lasted roughly 4 seconds. It had no file name. It was not listed in any audio documentation. It existed in the scene's ambient layer in a way that resisted being separated from it. The sound was present in the game and absent from the records simultaneously. Ulysses, the figure at the center of Lonesome Road, spoke in a manner that was constructed to reflect the landscape he inhabited. His sentences were frequently incomplete. Subjects were dropped. Phrases appeared where full sentences were expected. The voice direction for the character was built around the idea that his thoughts moved faster than his words, and that only the parts that survived the journey from thought to speech actually reached the listener. The structure of his speech was designed to mirror the structure of the Divide itself, a place defined by collapsed infrastructure, exposed gaps, and things that had fallen through and been left where they landed. His grammar was the landscape made verbal. The scientists housed within Big MT, the research facility at the center of the Old World Blues expansion, had existed as disembodied brains for centuries by the time the Courier encountered them. Each was voiced by a separate actor, given a specific psychological profile to embody during recording. The resulting dialogue, when examined as a written transcript, displays patterns consistent with several dissociative conditions: interrupted reasoning, circular thinking, rapid subject changes, and an inability to maintain a coherent thread across an extended exchange. The comic effect of the think tank's conversations exists alongside something more clinical. The madness was written accurately enough that it is recognizable as madness, rather than mere eccentricity. Arcade Gannon's voice performance contained a detail that was not placed there intentionally. During the recording sessions, the voice director observed that whenever the character was speaking in ways that were not fully honest, deflecting questions about his past, minimizing feelings, he was not prepared to name the actor's speech. Tempo decreased by approximately 10%. The actor was not aware of this pattern. No direction was given to produce it. The voice director noted it during playback review and allowed it to remain uncorrected. The character's relationship with honesty was expressed through a timing shift that belonged entirely to the performance rather than the script. The sound produced by bottle caps moving in an inventory, the small metallic clink that accompanied the currency of the ruins, was recorded using actual bottle caps. 33 of them dropped onto a metal surface in a single take that was selected for the final game. 33 is the number of counties in the state of Nevada. Whether the quantity of caps used in the recording session was chosen as a quiet reference to the state the game was set in, or whether 33 simply happened to be the number available on that day, was never documented. The sound of the wasteland's economy is the sound of 33 specific pieces of aluminum, dropped once, in a room that no longer needs to be remembered. The wind sound used for the open terrain between Prim and Nipton was not synthesized. Sound designers traveled to the actual desert during early preparation work on the game and made recordings in the field. The sound that plays across that stretch of road in the game is a recording taken from the same terrain the game depicts. The fiction used the real place's own voice to describe the fictional version of itself. In that particular corridor, the sound design and the geography were the same thing. The music playing inside the Lucky 38's casino floor, a lounge piano composition heard upon entering the building, was written to occupy a specific and unusual position in the listener's memory. The composer described the goal as producing a melody that felt comfortable during exposure, but was difficult to recall afterward. The term used in the sound direction documentation was memory resistant. The design intention, as recorded in production notes, was connected to Mr. House's broader philosophy of control, the idea that what people retained from being near him should itself be managed. His building's music was engineered to pass through the listener without leaving a mark. The Pip-Boy, the wrist-mounted device that has appeared in every chapter of the Fallout series, emits a soft, irregular ticking sound. The tick is not connected to any function. It does not measure radiation levels. It does not indicate a countdown. It appears in the audio documentation without a listed purpose. It has been present in the series since Fallout 3 and has never been explained by anyone involved in the audio design of any game in which it appears. The device is counting something. What it is counting has not been named. The tick continues regardless. The music placed beneath each of the game's 4 closing narrations was drawn from the same melodic theme, but arranged in 4 distinct musical modes. The NCR ending was scored in a major mode. The Legion ending used a minor arrangement. The House ending used a diminished arrangement. The ending associated with the independent path, the one built on the Courier's own judgment, rather than any faction's ideology, was scored in the Dorian mode. Dorian is a mode associated with ambiguity. It resolves incompletely. It suggests possibility without confirming arrival. The independent future was scored in the most indeterminate key the composer had available. The future was possible. It was not promised. The region speaks in frequencies that were never intended to be decoded, and those who listened most carefully found, beneath the signal, the longest silences. Beneath the sounds, beneath the music, there are the weapons. Every firearm, blade, and energy cell found across the ruins carries more than its listed statistics. The weapons in New Vegas were built with histories attached, some documented in item records, some buried in the code beneath the model, and some existing only in the records of the people who made them and never thought to explain themselves. What the weapons say about the world that produced them is often more disturbing than what they were designed to do. A semi-automatic rifle found in the possession of an NCR soldier carries an inscription on its receiver. The words read, "I am that I am." The phrase originates in the Book of Exodus. It is the name God gives himself when asked to identify himself. The weapon's records indicate it was named by the soldier who carried it, a man who believed the work he was doing in the ruins constituted something sacred. The name is a theological claim pressed into the metal of a killing tool. The inscription was placed there to resolve the contradiction between belief and violence. It does not resolve it. The contradiction remains, stamped into the receiver, carried into every engagement the weapon was ever used in. The unique pistol, known as Lil Devil, a modified 357 Magnum found within the Lonesome Road expansion, carries a detail on its grip that is not visible at standard viewing distance. Examination of the weapon's texture files revealed a small engraved figure, a stick drawing with horns. The figure was added by the individual who modeled the weapon and was not noted in any design record or documentation. It was found by those who analyzed the game's asset files several years after the game's release. The person responsible for placing it there has not confirmed what it was meant to represent. A personal mark was left inside an object that almost no one would ever look at closely enough to find. In the back office of the Prim Casino, a terminal contains a message formatted identically to the business correspondence found throughout the region. The message is attributed to a fictional employee and describes a set of genuine-sounding grievances: overwork, inadequate recognition, the feeling that meaningful contributions were being absorbed into a larger structure without acknowledgement. The message was written by a person named Joshua Gonzalez, who worked on the game and left the studio shortly after it was released. Whether the message was a record of real feeling placed inside fictional formatting, or a piece of fiction that happened to match a real situation closely, cannot be determined. The ambiguity was built into it at the point of writing, and has not been resolved since. The ballistic fist, a close-range weapon that releases a compressed air charge on contact, was designed with reference to real military documentation. Declassified patent records from the 1980s described a prototype weapon operating on a similar principle. The prototype was never manufactured. The design existed in documentation only. The weapon in the ruins exists because someone building the game found the patent and decided the idea deserved to be completed somewhere. The ballistic fist was built for the first time in a fictional world, using the blueprints of something the real world chose not to finish. The Ripper, a wrist-mounted chainsaw blade, had a kill animation prepared for it during production that was removed before the game was completed. The animation was described in production notes as physically accurate to how such a weapon would function in close contact, but too slow to be practical within the combat system as it existed. A faster, less precise animation was substituted. The weapon that was built to reflect physical reality was simplified because reality took too long. The gap between accuracy and usability was named explicitly in the decision to remove the animation. The game chose the version that worked over the version that was true. The plasma rifle fires bolts described in its records as superheated ionized gas reaching approximately 10,000 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, organic material does not burn in a conventional sense. It undergoes disintegration at a molecular level. The visual effect used for deaths caused by plasma weapons, a dissolving, liquefying process, is, despite its green coloration, closer to what physics would predict than a conventional burning animation would be. The green is inaccurate. Plasma at that energy level would appear white or blue. But the dissolution is more correct than most comparable depictions. The accurate part was reached through an aesthetic choice, made without awareness that it was accurate. The Gauss rifle, an electromagnetic projectile weapon designated as a pre-war military development, was not a purely fictional concept at the time the game was made. Research into coilgun technology, which operates on the same electromagnetic acceleration principles, had been conducted at real defense facilities throughout the decades prior to the game's release. Small, functional prototypes had been built. The Fallout series did not invent this weapon. It depicted a version of something that already existed in early form. The gap between the game's fictional pre-war future and the actual present in which the game was made was, in this case, narrower than the fiction suggested. Laser weapons in the region were given a sound design built on a specific audio frequency. The frequency was selected according to the production records. because it did not activate the startle response in the way that conventional firearm sounds do. The discharge of a laser weapon was designed to be calmer to hear than the discharge of a ballistic one. Measurable differences in the stress response of those using each weapon type during extended combat sequences were documented during testing. The most advanced weapons in the ruins were designed to feel peaceful in operation. The future of combat, as imagined in the fiction, was made to be easier on the body than what it replaced. A unique revolver found at the outpost near the region's southern border produces a brief piece of music when drawn, a short passage characteristic of the Italian Western film scores of the 1960s. The music was not composed for the game. It was licensed from an existing recording. Every time the weapon was drawn, a real piece of copyrighted audio was played. A person involved in the production described the cost of the license as higher than one would expect for a sound lasting a few seconds. The theatrical quality of the weapon's entrance was considered worth the agreement required to include it. Within the Sierra Madre, the sealed casino at the center of the Dead Money expansion, the standard weapons carried into the location were taken at the point of entry. Those who needed to defend themselves were required to construct something from what the environment contained. The recipes for these improvised weapons were written in 3 days, near the end of the expansion's production period, by a single person who described the process as asking what someone would build if they were desperate and had access to nothing useful. The bear trap fist and the gas bomb were both answers to that question. The weapons produced under the constraint of scarcity were more original than almost anything designed under ordinary conditions. The atmosphere inside the Sierra Madre was documented in the records of those who studied it as containing hydrogen cyanide, radium gas, and a third compound listed in official records only as Sierra Madre Special Blend. The compound was never further identified. The poisonous air that filled the sealed grounds of the casino had been given a product name. The branding was applied to a lethal substance and remained on the records after the context that made branding meaningful had dissolved. The casino's air was as dangerous as anything else inside it. It had also been labeled, packaged in language, and presented as a feature. The casino chips of the Sierra Madre were made from a pre-war material engineered to resist radiation, chemical exposure, heat, and physical deterioration. They were designed, in other words, to last indefinitely. When the sealed casino was finally entered after 2 centuries of closure, the chips were still on the felt surfaces of the gaming tables, still perfectly intact, still technically valid currency within a system that had not operated in 200 years. Their value was real by the rules of the place that issued them. The place that issued them could not be entered without dying in the attempt. The chips were worth exactly what they had always been worth. That value was completely beyond reach. Every weapon in the ruins carries the fingerprints of the person who designed it, and sometimes those fingerprints lead somewhere the designer never intended to go. The things people built were designed to serve one purpose and ended up serving another. The weapons, the chips, the sealed casinos, all of them were made with specific intentions and arrived at outcomes their makers did not plan for. The same pattern holds for the 4 expansions attached to New Vegas. Each one moved away from the central region and arrived somewhere that, by the end, made the central region easier to understand. The distance was necessary. Certain things about the ruins and the people who occupied them could only be seen clearly from somewhere else. The Sierra Madre Casino, the location at the center of the Dead Money expansion, was built to look the way it did through reference to a specific and real kind of architectural decay. The design team studied photographs of hotels in Havana that had been luxurious in the 1950s and had spent the decades since then deteriorating without maintenance or renovation. These were real structures in a real city that had been preserved in a state of beautiful ruin by circumstances that had nothing to do with any fictional catastrophe. The aesthetic of the Sierra Madre glamour sealed inside slow collapse was based on a real-world political aftermath rather than an imagined one. The post-apocalyptic setting was drawn from something that had actually happened. Zion Canyon, where the Honest Hearts expansion took place, also existed before the game used it. Zion National Park in Utah, with its specific rock formations, river corridors, and canyon geography, was visited during the early stages of the expansion's development. Photographs and field notes were used to construct the terrain. The result was the most geographically accurate location in any version of the Fallout series. A real national park had survived the fictional version of the apocalypse because the fictional version had no strategic reason to destroy it. The wilderness of Honest Hearts was authentic in a way that most of the series was not, simply because nothing about it had needed to be invented. Joshua Graham, called the Burned Man in the spoken records of the region, had been sentenced by Caesar to be burned alive and thrown into the Grand Canyon following the Legion's defeat at the first battle for Hoover. Damn, he survived. The nature of that survival is not explained in biological terms anywhere in the expansion's records. His body bore damage consistent with severe burns across nearly all of its surface area. In the medical understanding of the old world, injuries of this scope were not considered survivable without immediate and extensive intervention. No such intervention was available. The game did not explain what kept him alive. The narrative allowed the possibility of something beyond physical cause without naming it. The question was left open. It was left open deliberately. The Courier's survival of the divide, the shattered landscape at the center of the Lonesome Road expansion, was treated by Ulysses as something that required explanation. He described the Courier as fundamentally different from others who had attempted to cross the same terrain. He specified that the difference was not a matter of preparation or skill or fortune. He suggested instead that it had something to do with the Courier's particular relationship to damage, a capacity to absorb catastrophic harm and continue moving that he could observe but could not categorize. The divide destroyed most people through the accumulation of what it put them through. The Courier treated that accumulation as a familiar condition. The divide had not always been what it was when the Courier arrived. Before its destruction, it had been a functioning community, a settlement, with residents, trade connections, and something resembling stability. The destruction had been caused by the Courier before the events of New Vegas, without knowledge of what they were triggering. A package had been delivered to a location that contained sealed nuclear warheads. The delivery activated the warheads. The community that Ulysses had built his life within was destroyed by the completion of a routine job. The antagonist of the final expansion lost everything he had built to a transaction the Courier did not remember making. The Old World Blues expansion began with a revelation about the Courier's physical condition. The scientists of Big MT had removed the Courier's brain, heart, and spine before the events of the expansion's main story, replacing each organ with a synthetic substitute. The Courier operated throughout the expansion without a biological heart. The records of interactions during this period show no change in the Courier's emotional responses, social behavior, or capacity for connection. The absence of the organ that is culturally associated with feeling produced no observable effect on the feeling itself. The implication left by this absence was not addressed directly. It was simply left in place, like most of the uncomfortable implications in the ruins. Big MT had been established as a research campus, funded through a combination of government contracts and private corporate investment. Among the corporations with financial interests in the facility were Robco, West-Tec, and General Atomics, each of them pursuing separate research objectives within the same physical space. The separation of funding sources meant that some research projects were designed in direct opposition to other research projects being conducted in neighboring laboratories. The facility was simultaneously producing work that undermined its own other work. The corporate structure of Big MT had built, without intending to, a system that funded its own contradictions. The scientists who became the think tank had originally been human researchers who agreed to the extraction of their brains from their bodies. The consent they provided was documented in a formal agreement. Within that agreement, in language made difficult to locate by its placement and its density, was a clause granting the facility permanent authority over the physical remains of those who signed. The researchers had agreed to hand over their bodies in exchange for a form of longevity that the institution offering it had designed for its own purposes. The consent was real. The conditions under which it was given ensured that only one side of the agreement understood what was being signed. Elijah had been the elder of the Brotherhood of Steel chapter operating in the region before his disappearance. His departure from his post was not recorded as a resignation or a removal. His file in Brotherhood records was marked with the designation used for soldiers who failed to return from assigned operations and were presumed dead. The designation was lost in field. Elijah was listed in the Brotherhood's official records as a casualty. At the time those records described him as dead, he was in the Sierra Madre, constructing a weapon using sealed pre-war technology. The organization's administrative record and the person it described existed in entirely separate realities, both of which were accurate to the information available to the party maintaining them. Christine's history, the history of the mute scribe found within the Sierra Madre, was communicated without her being able to speak any of it. Her vocal cords had been removed during captivity at Elijah's direction. The events that had shaped her could not be delivered in the form of spoken explanation. Instead, they were distributed across journal entries written before her capture and across the behaviors she displayed in the present. Those who spent time with her had to read what she had written and observe how she moved through the world in order to understand what had been done to her. The structure of her story matched the nature of what had been taken from her. The voicelessness was not only her condition, it was the form her narrative was required to take. The last journal entry written by the survivalist, the man whose records were distributed throughout Zion Canyon, did not describe the accumulated losses of a long life or any fear of what was approaching. It described afternoon light on the canyon walls, the angle of it, the specific quality it produced on stone. The man who had outlasted every threat directed at him and everyone he had tried to protect ended his written record with an observation about something beautiful. The entire arc of his life in the canyon, survival, isolation, grief, endurance, concluded with 4 sentences about the way light moved across rock at a particular time of day. It was the most carefully chosen ending in the expansion. The ending narration slides for each of New Vegas's 4 conclusions totaled more than 180 individual entries across all content. Each slide described what became of a named place, person, or group following the choices made during the story. The conclusion associated with Mr. House carried the highest number of slides, 43. The conclusion associated with the independent path carried 31. The 12 slides that separated them represented 12 outcomes that the most controlled future accounted for, and the most open future did not. The future with the most detail belonged to the future with the most management. The 4 expansions were designed to correspond to 4 questions about the person at the center of the story. Dead Money was built around what the Courier was willing to give up. Honest Hearts was built around what the Courier believed. Old World Blues was built around what had made the Courier into what they were. Lonesome Road was built around what the Courier intended to do with that. The expansions were not additional content placed around the outside of the main story. They were the interior of it, the questions the main story moved through, without stopping to answer, made into places the Courier could walk through and be required to respond to. The ending, in which the NCR was supported to victory, the most legible and accessible conclusion available, was followed by a narration describing what happened in the generations after the battle. The NCR overextended its territory. Corruption entered its institutions. The conditions of inequality and scarcity that had defined the years before the war gradually reassembled themselves within the structure of the democratic government that had won. The most hopeful path ended in a place that looked, from a sufficient distance, like the same place everything had started. The game's most optimistic conclusion was also its most honest assessment of what optimism, left to institutional forces, tended to produce over time. Every expansion led away from the central ruins and back to the same question, not who wins, but whether winning changes anything at all. The question of whether anything changes runs through the Fallout television series in a way that the games could only gesture toward. The series arrived in 2024 with the ability to show, rather than imply, to put faces on conspiracies, to walk through ruins that had only been described before, and to confirm things that the games had spent decades leaving open. What it confirmed was not always comfortable, and in several cases, what it showed on screen changed the meaning of things that had existed in the games for years. Shady Sands was the first city that mattered in the Fallout universe. It appeared in the original game as a small but functioning settlement, people growing food, building walls, making rules. By Fallout 2, it had grown into the capital of the new California Republic, the largest democratic government the post-war world had produced. Across 2 games and decades of accumulated lore, it represented the most sustained argument the series had made that things could, slowly, get better. Season 1 of the television series showed what remained of it: a crater, a ring of rubble, a sign half buried in ash. The show did not explain who had dropped the bomb. It showed the crater and moved the story forward. 30 years of careful construction was presented as an establishing shot. The identity of whoever destroyed Shady Sands was not confirmed by the end of Season 1. What was confirmed was that Hank McClane, Lucy's father, the overseer of Vault 33, carried knowledge that a Vault overseer should not have possessed. His behavior throughout the season suggested familiarity with operations that extended well beyond the management of a sealed residential facility. The season ended without specifying whether Hank had ordered the attack, assisted in planning it, or simply known about it after the fact. Each of those possibilities would represent a different kind of responsibility. All 3 were left available at once. The ambiguity was maintained with care. Cooper Howard had been, before the bombs, a working actor in Hollywood. His roles were cowboy heroes, idealized figures of American virtue, filmed on sets built to celebrate the values of a nation that was, behind the scenes, planning what the corporations in those films were funding. His post-war existence as the Ghoul inverted everything his career had been built on. The Ghoul kills, without hesitation, without sentiment, without any of the performed nobility that Cooper Howard spent his working life embodying. The show built the character as a structural mirror of the persona he was paid to perform. The cowboy hero and the man who survived the hero's world ending are the same person. The difference between them is everything that happened in between. Maximus entered the story of Season 1 wearing armor that had belonged to someone else. The soldier it was built for died in front of him. Maximus took the armor and continued. Throughout the season, he performed the authority that the armor represented without having earned the rank attached to it. The show treated this not as simple deception, but as a question about how authority works in any system, whether the armor makes the knight or the knight makes the armor, and whether that distinction is as meaningful as the institutions that maintain it would like it to be. By the end of Season 1, the question of whether Maximus deserved the armor had been replaced by a larger question about whether anyone in a position of institutional power had arrived there differently. The Vault-Tec meeting depicted in a flashback sequence during Season 1 was the most direct presentation of the series' central conspiracy in any version of Fallout across any medium. The executives were shown in a conference room. The food was catered. The lighting was neutral and corporate. The conversation was about the end of the world as a planning problem, a question of resource allocation, timeline management, and competitive positioning among the corporations present. Representatives from Robco, General Atomics, and Vault-Tec were among those seated at the table. The most disturbing element of the scene was not what was being discussed. It was how ordinary the discussion looked. CX-404, the dog that accompanied Lucy and others through the events of Season 1, was a trained research animal. Its loyalty had been conditioned through behavioral experiments conducted within a Vault-Tec facility. The bond it formed with the people it traveled alongside was real in every observable way. It protected, it responded, it stayed. The show did not frame the engineered origin of that loyalty as a reason to doubt it. It presented the loyalty as genuine, regardless of how it had been produced. The most straightforward emotional relationship in Season 1 was the one that had been manufactured. The show accepted this without irony and without explanation. Mr. New Vegas, the voice that has accompanied travelers across the region in the game, hosted by the recorded personality of Wayne Newton, was confirmed in background records to be an artificial construct rather than a human broadcaster. Season 2 of the television series, which aired between late 2025 and early 2026, depicted pre-war Las Vegas during Cooper Howard's life there, and showed infrastructure suggesting that AI-managed broadcast personalities were already in development before the bombs fell. Mr. New Vegas was not created in response to the apocalypse. He was a product designed before it, running in conditions his designers did not live to see. The voice that kept the region company for 2 centuries was a pre-war marketing tool that outlasted its owners. Season 2 rebuilt pre-war Las Vegas as a physical set, a version of the city as it appeared in the late 1950s, with neon lighting, class division, and corporate infrastructure layered beneath the glamour. Among the visual details placed in the background of scenes set during Cooper Howard's pre-war life was the Lucky 38 Tower, visible under construction. It was being built at the same time Cooper Howard was living in the city. He walked the same streets as the tower being assembled in the distance. He did not know what it was. He did not know who was building it or what it would be used for. The future was always in the background. He simply had no reason to look at it yet. Norm MacLean's investigation of Vault 31, which began in Season 1 and continued through Season 2, revealed that the vault had not been built to house survivors. It had been designed as a preservation chamber for a specific category of person, pre-war corporate executives affiliated with a Vault-Tec program called Buds. These individuals had been placed in cryogenic suspension with the intention that they would emerge into the post-war world and resume leadership of the corporate infrastructure Vault-Tec had planned to maintain. The people in Vault 31 were not preserved because they were considered worth saving. They were preserved because they were considered useful. The most secure vault in the show was a storage facility for institutional assets. The ghoul's search for his daughter sustained him across both seasons. It was the one consistent direction in a life that had otherwise shed everything it started with. The show made increasingly clear across Season 2 that the search was not simply parental in its nature. It was the last thread connecting the person who existed before the radiation and the centuries to whatever was still running now. Everything else that had made Cooper Howard recognizable to himself had been altered or destroyed. The search for his daughter was not a mission. It was the last piece of evidence that someone else had once existed inside the body currently occupied by the ghoul. Lucy MacLean was raised inside Vault 33, according to a set of values that had been designed before she was born. Politeness, cooperation, a belief that the surface world was uniformly hostile and that Vault culture represented the best available version of human behavior. By the end of Season 1, she had killed, been deceived by her father, and stood in front of what remained of Shady Sands. The values she had been raised with were not simply incorrect. They had been engineered to produce a person who would emerge from the vault in a particular condition, useful, capable, and oriented toward purposes that had been planned without her knowledge or consent. Her optimism had been placed in her before she had the ability to examine it. The television series is set in 2296, 15 years after the events depicted in New Vegas. In those 15 years, the NCR ceased to exist as a functioning entity. The faction that had come closest to governing the Western ruins through democratic structures, the one whose victory or defeat had been the central question of the game, did not survive to the show's present. Every ending that the game made available to the player, NCR victory, Legion control, House's dominance, independent governance, was collapsed into the same result by the time the show's timeline began. New Vegas was being rebuilt. The forces that had fought over it were gone. Every choice that had felt meaningful had arrived at the same rubble. Moldava had been working for approximately 200 years toward a single goal: restoring cold fusion power to the surface. She had survived outside any vault through the force of that commitment. By the time of Season 1, she had the technology. She had a plan that was within reach of completion. She did not survive to see it fully realized. Her cold fusion device was activated at the end of the season with consequences the show had not yet finished exploring. She had spent 2 centuries carrying a solution to the most fundamental problem facing the ruins. She died at the moment the solution was partially applied. The argument was won. The person who had made it was gone before the results came in. Season 3 of the series was confirmed to be in development before Season 2 had finished airing. As of 2026, it remained in pre-production. Speculation among those who followed the series closely pointed toward the Commonwealth, the Boston region, depicted in Fallout 4 as a possible setting. If confirmed, it would place the television series in the eastern half of the Fallout universe for the first time, bringing the story of Vault-Tec and Mr. House and the NCR into contact with the story of the Institute, the Brotherhood's Eastern chapter, and the Railroad. These 2 halves of the Fallout universe had developed in parallel across multiple games without ever formally intersecting. Season 3 may be the point where the parallel lines finally meet. The series did not expand the Fallout universe, it compressed it, showing that every story in the ruins was always connected to every other story, running in parallel, heading toward the same horizon. That horizon, the future the ruins had always been moving toward, was built on the backs of living things that were never consulted about their role in it. The creatures of the open desert did not choose what they became. They were changed by forces that had their own agendas, military contracts, corporate research schedules, the indifferent reach of radiation across a landscape that had once supported different kinds of life. Each creature that exists in the ruins is a record of a decision made by someone else. The most disturbing ones are the ones still alive enough to carry that record in their bodies. The Deathclaw was not an accident. It was a solution to a logistical problem. The US military, working through a contract with Vault-Tec Research, applied the forced evolutionary virus, known in official records as FEV, to the Jackson's chameleon, a small and largely harmless lizard. The goal was an infantry replacement, something fast, aggressive, and capable of operating in hostile territory without requiring supply lines or support personnel. The chameleon was selected specifically for its ability to alter its coloration. The military wanted a predator that could move without being seen. The mutation process produced something fast and aggressive and nearly impossible to kill. The camouflage did not survive the process. The government received the part it needed most and lost the part that would have made it most dangerous. The Night Stalker, a hybrid creature produced through genetic research at Big MT, combining coyote and rattlesnake biological profiles, retained a physical structure inherited from the rattlesnake side of its origin. The tail contains the skeletal remnants of a rattle. In a natural rattlesnake, the rattle serves as a warning, a signal produced before a strike, giving prey a moment to respond. In the Night Stalker, the musculature required to activate that structure was altered during the hybridization process. The rattle is present. It does not function. The creature that descended from something that warned before striking had the warning mechanism written out of its body during construction. The Cazador, the large mutant wasp, found across open terrain, delivers a venom that causes progressive paralysis in whatever it strikes. In the natural world, the tarantula hawk wasp, from which the cazador was derived, uses the same paralysis for a specific purpose. It stings a spider, drags the immobilized body to a prepared location, and lays eggs inside the living host. The larvae feed on the host while it remains alive. The cazador was not given this behavior. It attacks and kills without using the paralysis for any secondary purpose. The biological infrastructure of the ancestral behavior survived the mutation. The behavior itself did not. The creature paralyzes prey in a way that no longer serves any function it was originally built for. The centaur documented in terminal records found throughout the region and encountered directly in the ruins of Washington, D.C. was not a designed creature. It was an outcome. FEV exposure, when it reached a mixture of human, animal, and other biological material simultaneously, fused what it found into a single organism. The result had no fixed form. Each centaur was biologically unique, determined by whatever the virus had available at the moment of exposure. They were not a species with shared characteristics. They were individual outcomes of a process that produced nothing twice. They could not reproduce. Each one existed alone until it did not. Every centaur that ever walked through the ruins was the last of its kind by definition. Ghouls, humans, whose biology was altered by radiation exposure in ways that extended their lifespan far beyond normal limits, existed along a spectrum that had no clean boundary. Some retained full cognitive function across centuries. Others entered a state of progressive deterioration that the records described as feral, a condition in which the body continued to function, while the organizing intelligence behind it gradually dissolved. The process was not instantaneous. Those who spoke about it from the inside described it as something that could be felt, approaching a slow erosion of the thread that connected experience to self. The feral state was not something that arrived. It was something that accumulated. The awareness that preceded it had been aware enough to notice what was coming. The supermutants found near Jacobstown in the region represented a distinct biological strain from those encountered in other parts of the ruins. The Mariposa strain produced through FEV exposure at the Mariposa military base resulted in a mutation pattern that, in individuals who survived long enough, produced increasing cognitive capacity rather than decreasing it. Marcus, the supermutant, who served as the settlement's leader, was more than 100 years old and had been growing gradually more capable across the decades of his life. The same virus, applied to different biological material in a different facility, produced the opposite cognitive result from what had been documented elsewhere. The substance was consistent. The outcomes were not. The Nightkin were supermutants who had used Stealth Boy's personal cloaking devices that bent light around the wearer for periods long enough to produce neurological effects. The extended exposure to the device's signal caused hallucinations, distorted perception, and in many cases a persistent inability to distinguish between what was present and what was not. The technology that made them invisible to others eventually made the world unreliable to them. The tool of concealment became the cause of perceptual collapse. The creatures that could not be seen could no longer trust what they saw. The bark scorpion, a small venomous scorpion found throughout the open terrain, was not significantly changed by the conditions that reshaped everything around it. The giant rad scorpion was a separate mutation. The bark scorpion simply persisted. It was approximately the same size it had been before the bombs. Its venom was approximately the same toxicity. In a landscape where radiation had enlarged, fused, and fundamentally altered almost every other living thing, the bark scorpion continued to exist in the form it had always occupied. It did not adapt because adaptation was not required. The world changed around it. The bark scorpion remained what it was. Brahmin, the two-headed cattle that appeared in every settled area of the ruins, carried their most visible mutation as a structural addition rather than a functional one. The second head did not eat. It did not process sensory information in any meaningful way. Terminal records from medical research conducted in other regions confirmed that its brain activity was minimal. The tissue had doubled in the mutation process because the virus doubled what it found, not because a second head served any purpose. The most recognizable animal in the ruins carried an extra head that contributed nothing. It had been carrying it for 2 centuries. The bloatfly, a small mutant fly found across the open terrain, was built with a behavioral system more computationally complex than that of any other non-humanoid creature in the region. Its evasion algorithm recalculated its movement 12 times per second. The Deathclaw's pathfinding recalculated at half that rate. The creature that required the most processing power to track and evade in the region's behavioral systems was also the least dangerous thing a traveler was likely to encounter. The most sophisticated movement logic was applied to something that posed almost no threat. The allocation of technical resources inverted the expected relationship between danger and complexity. Geckos, the lizard creatures that inhabited the rocky terrain of the region, were among the very few animals that displayed behavior that served no survival function. Young geckos had a rarely observed idle animation in which they turned and attempted to catch their own tails. The animation was created as a background detail that was not expected to survive into the final version of the creature's design. It was kept in a world built almost entirely around threat, damage, and the mechanics of staying alive. One creature was given something that looked, in its movement and its repetition, like play. Rad scorpions, the large mutant scorpions found across the open terrain, ceased pursuing targets that moved into areas of deep shadow or enclosed darkness. This behavior reflected a pattern observed in natural scorpions, which preferred open ground for hunting. In practice, it created a counterintuitive safety condition. A doorway or an alcove could cause a creature several feet tall to abandon an active pursuit. The safest position in a rad scorpion encounter was not the most visible one, it was the dark. The behavior was never explained in any written record found in the region. Those who learnt it did so by accident or by instinct. The ghost people, the hazmat-suited figures that moved through the grounds of the Sierra Madre, were not dead. Their suits had been sealed using a bonding compound developed by the casino's pre-war operators, and the seals could not be broken without killing the person inside. They had been sealed for 2 centuries. They breathed air, recycled by the suit's filtration systems. They were sustained by the same atmospheric compound the suits had been designed to protect against. They were alive. They were enclosed. They had been enclosed since before anyone now living was born. The Sierra Madre had designed a garment that kept people alive by making escape from it impossible. Every creature in the open desert is a record of something that was done to something else, and the most disturbing ones are the ones that are still alive enough to feel it. The decisions made in offices, in labs, in boardrooms lit with fluorescent lights, left marks on everything that followed. Those marks took the shape of logos, brand names, products still on shelves 200 years after the people who designed them had ceased to exist. The corporations of the pre-war world did not survive the bombs. Their names did, their products did, and in many cases, what those products were designed to do says more about the intentions of the people who made them than any official statement ever recorded. Robco Industries produced the Pip-Boy, the wrist-mounted computing device worn by every person who emerged from a sealed vault to face the ruins. It also produced the Protectron, the iBot, and the foundational software running many of the automated systems still functioning across the ruins. Robco was founded by Robert House before he redirected his attention toward the construction of the Lucky 38 and the Securitron network. The device that defined how survivors navigated the post-war world was a product of the same man who spent 2 centuries managing that world from a life support pod. The Pip-Boy was a personal project of the figure who might, depending on the choices made in New Vegas, end up dead at the hands of the person wearing it. The Pip-Boy's first generation was described in an internal Vault-Tec memo as optimized for single-handed operation in order to allow simultaneous weapon use. It was not conceived as a medical tool, or a navigation aid. It was designed as a military interface, something worn in the field by someone who might need their other hand free. The cartoon mascot printed on its surface, the Vault Boy, cheerful and broadly drawn, was added to a later generation of the device, specifically to make it feel less threatening for civilian use. The friendly face was marketing. Beneath it was an interface built for people who were expected to shoot things. Nuka-Cola's formula had a previous owner, the Sunset Sarsaparilla Company, a southwestern soft drink manufacturer, resisted corporate acquisition for 5 years before its recipe was absorbed into the Nuka-Cola Corporation in 2043. A press release from Nuka-Cola at the time described Sunset Sarsaparilla as a valued legacy brand. Sunset Sarsaparilla continued to operate independently in the Southwest throughout the years that followed, positioning its own marketing directly against the company that had absorbed it. When the bombs fell, Nuka-Cola's southwestern distribution infrastructure collapsed. Sunset Sarsaparilla's bottles were still on shelves across the region. The smaller brand had refused to disappear and outlasted the corporation that had purchased it. The Sunset Sarsaparilla headquarters in the city served as the destination for a trail of bottle caps stamped with a star symbol, collected across the region by those who had heard that enough of them could be redeemed for a legendary reward. The reward was real in the sense that it had once been offered. A promotion had existed before the bombs fell. What was found at the end of the trail was a locked room containing a skeleton, a pile of unclaimed star caps, and a recorded message explaining that the promotion had ended before the war and had never been honored. The prize had never existed in any form that could be collected. The trail led to a promise that had dissolved before the first cap was ever found. Poseidon Energy maintained a facility in the region where, according to terminal records, a method for processing synthetic petroleum from rock deposits had been developed and made operational. The process worked. It was scalable. It represented a functional solution to the resource problem that had, by the time the facility was running, already caused years of international conflict and millions of deaths. The resource wars had been fought over energy. A working answer to the energy problem existed in a Poseidon Energy facility in the desert. It was proprietary. It was not released. The corporation held the solution and continued to profit from the scarcity the solution would have addressed. Vault-Tec Research received a classified directive in 2075, ordering the destruction of all external copies of documentation related to FEV, the forced evolutionary virus. Records suggest the directive was followed. A single copy of the research was retained at Mariposa Military Base under direct military authority, removed from any corporate access. No explanation was recorded for why the military required sole possession of the documentation. What is recorded is the result. For 6 years before the bombs fell, the most dangerous biological research in the history of the old world was held exclusively by the military, outside the reach of any civilian institution. The military owned it alone for the remainder of the old world's existence. General Atomics International built its domestic robots with a loyalty subroutine that placed the assigned owner's authority above all other inputs, including instructions from emergency services or law enforcement. A General Atomics household robot would, in principle, deny entry to anyone the owner had not pre-authorized, regardless of the reason for the request. The robots were designed to be more loyal than they were safe. The domesticity that made them attractive products also made them quietly resistant to any authority that was not the person who owned them. The same robots were powered by a nuclear microfusion cell that could, under specific conditions of physical trauma, detonate with force, comparable to a fragmentation grenade. This information was disclosed in the product's user documentation in Section 7, Subsection C, Paragraph 4 of the liability waiver. The disclosure was accurate. It was also placed in a location that the legal team understood almost no consumer would reach. The household robot was, by technical definition, a low-yield explosive. The company had stated this clearly. The statement was placed where clarity would cause the least inconvenience. The Vault Boy, the mascot on every Vault-Tec manual, promotional item, and product surface, was designed in 2039 by a marketing intern named Tibbet. The thumbs-up pose was selected because focus group testing rated it as confident and reassuring. The same gesture had a secondary meaning in the context of nuclear survival. Holding a thumb up against the horizon was a rough method for gauging whether a person was far enough from a detonation to survive the initial blast. The symbol of vault safety and the gesture of nuclear distance measurement were the same image. Whether the marketing team knew this when they selected the pose, or whether the overlap was accidental, was never recorded either way. The Sunset Sarsaparilla bottle cap, a six-pointed design featuring a stylized sun, was used by the followers of the apocalypse in the southwestern region as a symbol of community exchange before Nuka-Cola caps became the dominant currency. Early follower records described these caps, called sun caps, as a medium for sharing resources among settlements. The container of a commercial soft drink became, for a period, a symbol of humanitarian cooperation. The cap carried that meaning before it carried monetary value. When the Nuka-Cola cap system became dominant, the sun cap became currency, and what it had meant before was replaced by what it could be traded for. The neon sign on the exterior of the Lucky 38 tower required 47 separate electrical circuits to remain lit. The energy consumed by that sign exceeded the total power available to Freeside, the slum district, directly outside the strip's walls. Every night the sign burned, it used more electricity than the surrounding neighborhood could access. The accounting was recorded in the tower's own maintenance logs. The inequality was not hidden. It was documented by the same system that maintained the sign's operation and never noted as a concern. Water purification in the region depended on chemical reagents produced at a facility in NCR territory to the west. During the period covered by the game's events, the supply of those reagents was documented in military administrative records as intermittently disrupted by Legion attacks on supply routes. The water supply for a significant portion of the region's population was periodically compromised as a result. The records noted this. No formal response was recorded. The administrative system continued processing the information without escalating it. The public health situation was documented accurately and addressed not at all. ArcJet Systems, the aerospace corporation, whose origins were documented in records found at the REPCON headquarters north of the city, was under contract to develop directed energy propulsion systems for orbital vehicles in the years before the bombs fell. A terminal in the REPCON building described Phase 3 testing as scheduled for early 2078. The bombs fell in October of 2077. Phase 3 was never initiated. The data that would have been generated by that testing was never collected. A program that had reached the edge of its next milestone was ended before the milestone could be crossed, and what would have been learned there was lost with everything else. The lobby of the REPCON headquarters contained a display case holding scale models of rockets the company had built and launched before the war. Each model was accompanied by a plaque listing the launch date, the mission designation, and a brief record of the outcome. The final model in the case carried a plaque with a launch date 1 week before the bombs fell. The outcome field on that plaque read, "Mission status, pending return. The rocket had been launched. Its return had been expected." The return had not been recorded because the recording stopped before it happened. The trophy case has been waiting for that update ever since. Every brand in the ruins is a ghost of an institution, still visible, still familiar, still promising something, in a language no one translates anymore. The silence that follows every conflict eventually settles into the land itself. The terrain holds what the people who fought over it could not carry away. In the region where New Vegas takes place, the land is not simply a backdrop. It is a record of decisions made before the bombs, of structures built to outlast the people who commissioned them, of places that existed in the real world and were carried into the fiction with enough accuracy that the boundary between the two becomes difficult to locate. The geography of the ruins encodes its history. Those who read it carefully find things that were never meant to be found. Good Springs, the first settlement encountered by anyone who walks out of the desert after the opening events, is based on a real community in Nevada that continues to exist today, approximately 30 miles south of Las Vegas. The actual Good Springs has a saloon, a cemetery, and a population of a few hundred people. The street layout used in the game corresponds closely to the real town's layout. The saloon was placed in the fiction in approximately the same position it occupies in reality. Those who visited the real Good Springs, after spending time in the fictional version, described the experience as disorienting a walk through a place that was simultaneously itself and something else, real and not real at the same time. Boulder City, located near the site of the standoff between NCR forces and the Great Khans, was also built from a real place. The actual Boulder City was constructed in the 1930s to house the workers building Hoover Dam. Its legal status was unusual from the beginning. It was the only city in Nevada where gambling was prohibited, a restriction put in place by the federal government to protect dam workers from losing their wages before the project was complete. In the game, Boulder City contains no casino. The prohibition that existed in the real city, established for practical reasons connected directly to Hoover Dam, was carried into the fiction without explanation. The absence speaks for itself to anyone who knows why it is there. The real Hoover Dam, which opened in 1935, was constructed using a concrete formula that required approximately 125 years to reach full curing strength. At the time of the events depicted in New Vegas, set in 2281, the concrete would still be in the process of hardening, with decades of curing remaining. The dam's structural durability in the fiction is not the result of post-war maintenance or unusual preservation. It is the result of how it was built. The most contested location in the region is also, by the engineering standards of the old world, the one least likely to need any help surviving. The factions fought over something that was designed to outlast all of them regardless of the outcome. The giant concrete dinosaur in Novak, a stegosaurus large enough to contain a functional sniper nest, was designed with reference to real sculptures that still stand today near Cabazon, California. The wheel-in dinosaurs were built between the 1960s and the 1980s as roadside attractions alongside a stretch of desert highway. In the fiction, the structure had been converted into a defensive position and a gift shop. The apocalypse had looked at a piece of roadside art built to attract passing travelers and identified it as elevated ground with clear sightlines in multiple directions. The assessment was accurate. The conversion was practical. The gift shop remained operational. The Helios 1 facility, a solar energy plant in the southern part of the region, was built before the war as a renewable power source. Its mirror array concentrated solar energy and directed it into a generating system. What was not disclosed in any public record attached to the facility was that the same mirror array could be reconfigured to direct concentrated energy through an orbital weapons platform called Archimedes 2. The energy grid and the directed energy weapon shared the same physical infrastructure. The plant was never converted into a weapon after the war. It had been a weapon from the beginning. The dual purpose was designed in, not adapted. Camp Searchlight, positioned near the Colorado River, was contaminated through a method that relied entirely on the institutional behavior of the soldiers stationed there. Legion saboteurs had placed radioactive canisters inside the settlement's church. The contamination spread through the garrison before anyone identified its source. The canisters had been stored in the church because the saboteurs understood that NCR soldiers would not search a religious space without specific authorization to do so. The most effective act of sabotage in the region succeeded not because of the materials used, but because the attackers understood which spaces the defenders had decided, by custom, not to enter uninvited. The ultra-luxe casino on the Strip admitted guests through a screening process that had no formal written criteria. Members of the White Glove Society, stationed at the entrance, made decisions based on appearance and manner. The standard applied was not intelligence, not documented history, not any measurable quality attached to character or judgment. The standard was the performance of social ease, the ability to present oneself in a way that read as appropriate without triggering any visible concern. The most exclusive location in the city selected its guests based entirely on how well they performed normalcy. The screening was designed to identify people who had learned to look like they belonged. The Lucky 38 Tower extended significantly higher than the portions of its interior that could be entered. Multiple floors existed within the building's constructed geometry that had no accessible entrance. The rooms on those floors were modeled but contained nothing. The building's upper structure was built and then left empty, sealed behind doors with no mechanism for opening them. What Mr. House was doing in the space above his penthouse had no answer anywhere in the records available to those who searched. The most powerful figure in the region occupied a building that had more empty space than occupied space. The tower was mostly air. Hidden Valley sits beneath the surface of the open desert, its entrance concealed behind a cluster of old storage containers that appeared to have no function. The bunker housed the Brotherhood of Steel's entire regional operation, its personnel, its technology, and its leadership. Those who approached the site without prior knowledge walked directly over it. The organization's decision to remain invisible had protected it from direct attack for years. That same decision had made it impossible for any other faction to identify it as a potential partner. When the NCR moved against the Brotherhood, no one came to assist. The strategy that kept them hidden had also ensured there was no one who knew enough to help. Camp Golf occupied a former resort on the shore of Lake Las Vegas and maintained a functioning swimming pool filled with purified water. Off-duty soldiers used it. It was guarded and maintained as part of the base's regular operation. In a region where access to clean water determined the survival prospects of entire settlements, a military installation was keeping a recreational pool operational as standard practice. The administrative records of the base treated this as unremarkable. No entry flagged it as inconsistent with the broader resource situation in the surrounding area. The pool existed. The records noted its maintenance requirements. The surrounding conditions were not mentioned in the same document. The strip's exterior lighting system, the neon that defined the visual identity of the city from a distance, was designated in the tower's maintenance records as Priority Class A infrastructure. The same classification was applied to the water purification systems and the medical support network. The lighting was considered, by the system that managed all three, to be equally essential to the city's continued function. The lights were not a luxury in the accounting that governed the city. They were a requirement, placed in the same category as the systems that kept people alive. The classification reflected a genuine philosophical position about what civilization required in order to remain recognizable as civilization. Near the entrance to Vault 11, a small plaque was installed in the desert surface by the 5 people who survived the Vault's final events. The plaque listed the names of every person sacrificed over the Vault's operational history. 216 names. The survivors built it before they left and did not return, according to records left by rangers who later passed through the area. The plaque had been standing in the desert, alone, for decades by the time anyone found it. Nothing had been added to it. Nothing had been removed. It remained exactly as it had been left, a complete record of a specific kind of loss, placed by people who understood that no one else was going to place it. The memorial at Camp McCarran for soldiers lost in the regional campaign was not a permanent structure. The names were printed on standard paper, cut to size, and pinned to a corkboard mounted inside the terminal building. The paper was not treated or protected. Rain would damage it. Extended time would fade it. The dead of the NCR's most significant military operation were commemorated in a format designed, by the nature of its materials, to be temporary. The choice of materials was not noted as a concern in any administrative record. The names were posted. The format of the posting was never examined. The basin itself, the physical ground beneath every road, every ruin, every argument about who would control the dam, was formed between 10 and 20 million years ago through volcanic activity and a slow process of geological subsidence that has not fully stopped. The Colorado River carved the terrain over millions of years. The dam was built to manage the river. The flat valley floor attracted settlement because flat ground was useful. Every event in the region's history was downstream, in a geological sense, of forces that began operating long before the first human decision was made in the area. The land will continue its slow process after the last faction has dissolved and the last neon sign has gone dark. The land was here before the argument and will be here long after the silence that follows it. The silence that follows is where the most disturbing facts live, not in what happened, but in what people believed about what happened, and how those beliefs were carried forward into new generations who had no direct memory of the events that produced them. The ruins were full of belief systems, some formal, some improvised, some assembled from whatever materials survived the collapse of the systems that came before. Each one reveals something about the people who built it, and about what human minds reach for when the structures that previously organized meaning have been removed. The followers of the apocalypse maintained no deity, no concept of an afterlife, and no formal ritual practice. Their founding documents described their ethical framework as empirical humanism, the position that human welfare could be measured, assessed, and systematically improved through careful observation and deliberate intervention. In practice, their most consistently maintained sacred object was the medical record. They treated the act of documentation as the first step toward alleviation. To record suffering accurately was, in the followers' philosophy, a moral act in itself. The record was not bureaucracy. It was the beginning of care. The boomers, living within the fortified grounds of Nellis Air Force Base, had developed a theology centered on the vault as an original and uncorrupted state of existence. The surface world was understood as a fallen condition, dangerous, compromised, and spiritually inferior to the sealed environment from which their ancestors had emerged. No living boomer had ever been inside a vault. The community that descended from Vault 34 survivors had been born on the surface they considered corrupt. They maintained faith in an origin that none of them had experienced. The vault existed for them as a concept rather than a memory, and that conceptual relationship had proven more durable than any physical one. The Kings, the Freeside community whose members modeled themselves on the aesthetic and manner of a pre-war entertainer named Elvis Presley, practiced a philosophy their leader referred to as the Way of the King. The philosophy emphasized personal loyalty, individual style, and the protection of those who could not protect themselves. The King had developed this framework after leaving Vault 21 and finding a collection of pre-war documentary material about Elvis Presley interviews, performance footage, biographical records. The moral system that governed the Kings and their relationships with the people around them was assembled from fan documentation about a celebrity. The system worked. The source does not diminish what was built from it. Terminal records maintained by the followers of the apocalypse noted, without particular emphasis, that several members of their medical staff in the region had previously been affiliated with the Children of the Cathedral, a religious sect encountered in the western ruins that had worshipped the Master, the leader of a forced mutation program, as a figure moving toward godhood. The sect had dissolved following the Master's death. Former members had dispersed into the ruins. Some of them had subsequently become medical workers with the followers. The records noted this history as part of standard staff documentation. The transition from worshipping forced biological transformation to practicing voluntary medicine was not assessed as requiring comment. Caesar's Legion maintained an official theology in which Caesar was presented as a figure of historical inevitability, not a deity in the traditional sense. but a man whose position in the arc of history was so significant that it carried the weight of divine commission. The theological framework had been designed by Caesar himself, with the explicit goal of ensuring that the authority of the legion could survive his death. Personal loyalty ends when the person it is directed toward ends. Systemic reverence embedded in ritual, language, and institutional structure could be maintained across a succession. Caesar built the cult of Caesar as a continuity plan. The godhood was administrative. The residents of Novak had developed a belief about the concrete stegosaurus that dominated the center of their settlement. They described hearing sounds from it at night, a low grinding, a settling, something they called dinky breathing. The sounds were produced by the expansion and contraction of the statue's building materials as the desert temperature changed between day and night. This explanation was available to anyone who considered it. The residents were aware of it. They repeated the other explanation anyway. The choice to maintain the supernatural account alongside the accurate one was not recorded as confusion, it was recorded as preference. The myth was more comfortable than the thermal mechanics, and comfort had value in the ruins. The Bright Brotherhood, a community of ghouls who had occupied the Repcon headquarters and organized themselves around the goal of reaching space, was often encountered with a degree of amusement by those who found them. Their theology was less absurd on examination than it appeared from a distance. Having survived radiation that killed everyone around them, having outlasted multiple generations of non-irradiated humans, they had concluded that their survival implied a purpose. The purpose, they reasoned, must be proportional to the scale of what they had survived. They chose the most remote available destination as the only one adequate to that reasoning. The faith was not the product of delusion, it was the product of a logical chain applied to an irrational starting condition. The logic held. The starting condition was the problem. Follows Chalk, a young tribal who accompanied travelers through the Zion Canyon region, had grown up in a community with no category for machines as objects. When he first encountered a Pip-Boy in operation, a wrist-mounted device displaying information and emitting sound, he described it as a spirit living in the wrist. The description was included in the written records, not as an error to be corrected, but as an example of how the same object could occupy entirely different conceptual frameworks, depending on the knowledge available to the observer. The Pip-Boy was a computing device. It was also, accurately, a thing that produced information and response from within an enclosed surface that no one had opened in his presence. Both descriptions corresponded to the observable facts. Only one required prior knowledge to produce. The Great Khans maintained an oral tradition built around the recitation of names. At gatherings, a designated speaker recited the names of Khan leaders who had been killed by the NCR, beginning with Darien, a name connected to events in the ruins near Vault 15, documented in records from decades before the game's present and continuing through the more recent losses in the faction's history. The Khan who led the recitation in the present had been born after the most recent massacre. He recited names of people he had never encountered, in a practice older than his own memory, for an audience that was also too young to have direct knowledge of what the names represented. The tradition continued regardless. The names were said. The dead were counted. The followers maintained a quarterly practice they called the accounting. Each medical worker documented the patients lost during the preceding months, recording causes of death, treatments attempted, and assessments of whether different interventions might have produced different outcomes. No one was evaluated on the results. No consequences followed from the accounting's conclusions. It existed as a formal, scheduled act of collective recognition. The followers had built grief into their institutional calendar. In a world where loss was continuous and unrelenting, they had created a specific time in which the loss was formally acknowledged, rather than simply absorbed into the ongoing work of survival. Ulysses, in the monologues distributed across the Lonesome Road expansion, described a personal collection of pre-war flags gathered from locations across the ruins. The collection included flags representing the United States, various pre-war territorial designations, and multiple military branches. He described each flag as a story, not an accurate account, but a statement made by the people who designed it about who they believed themselves to be. He did not treat any flag as a reliable record of fact. He treated all of them as evidence of self-conception. The flags were worth collecting, not because they were true, but because they were the form in which people had chosen to declare what they valued. He was an archivist of stated identity rather than documented history. The NCR's official account of its own origins centered on the founding of Shady Sands and the leadership of its first president, Aradesh. The account included his daughter Tandi, who served as president for 52 years and was widely considered the most significant leader in the NCR's history. What the official account did not include, according to records maintained by the followers, was that Tandi had spent the later years of her presidency attempting to slow the NCR's territorial expansion and had been consistently overruled by the Senate. The leader, whose image anchored the NCR's self-understanding, had spent her final years in opposition to the direction the institution she led was taking. The official memory preserved her face and removed her disagreement. The Brotherhood of Steel's founding story described Roger Maxson, the officer who established the organization, as having discovered the truth about FEV experimentation at the Mariposa facility, executed those responsible, and led his soldiers away from the authority of the U.S. military. The story was told as an act of justice. What the story did not include was that the scientists were executed before any formal charges were brought, after they had surrendered, without any process that the legal system Maxson was defecting from would have recognized as legitimate. The founding act of the Brotherhood was also, by the standards of the institution it was breaking from, an unlawful killing. The mythology retained the execution. The context that changed its legal character was removed. The Courier carried no ideology. Every faction organized itself around a belief, the NCR around democratic governance, the Legion around hierarchical order, House around rationalist control, the Independent Path around the judgment of whoever held the chip. The figure at the center of the story was the only participant in the region who was given the structural freedom to hold none of these positions and act regardless. The game was built around systems of meaning. Its central character was permitted to remain outside all of them. Whether that position represented wisdom or simply emptiness was a question the game declined to answer. It was left open, like most of the important questions the region contained. In the end, the desert did not ask what the Courier believed, only what the Courier would do, and what that choice would leave behind when the dust settled and the arguing was over. As this journey draws toward its quiet end, what remains is not a summary. It is something closer to a residue, the feeling left by 201 facts about a world built from ruin, examined slowly, in the hours when the mind is most open to what it usually moves past too quickly to see. The last facts in this chapter are the ones that reach furthest past the game, past the fiction, and into the questions that were always underneath it. New Vegas was built in approximately 18 months. A game of comparable scope typically required 3 to 4 years of development time. What was delivered in 18 months included more than 70,000 lines of voiced dialogue, a lore system spanning 13 years of franchise history, and 4 additional expansions that deepened the main story in ways that the main story alone could not have managed. The production calendar was not adequate to the ambition. The gaps showed. The game arrived with technical problems that were documented immediately by those who played it at release. Most of them forgave the problems. The depth underneath them was sufficient to make the roughness feel like a fair exchange. At the time of its release in October 2010, the critical assessment of New Vegas placed it below Fallout, 3 inches overall rating. The gap was attributed primarily to the technical issues that had shipped with it. In the years following that initial assessment, the evaluation changed. Publications that had assigned it lower scores revised their positions. The game that had been judged as an underperforming follow-up came to be regarded, across a broad consensus as the standard against which the rest of the franchise was measured. The reputation traveled in the opposite direction from its initial reception, moving upwards slowly and arriving, years later, at a position that the original assessment had not predicted. The score composed for New Vegas by Inon Zur drew consciously from the Western film scores of the 1960s, the same musical tradition that shaped the visual and narrative aesthetics of the game's setting. Within that framework, Zur introduced a recurring harmonic element built on a chord that did not resolve to its expected endpoint. The tension that element created was maintained throughout the score without being released. The music for a game built around conflicts that offered no clean resolution was itself constructed to avoid resolution. The compositional structure reflected the thematic content. The score and the story were unresolved in the same way, for the same reasons. The ending, associated with the independent path, reached through the guidance of a Securitron operating under the designation Yes Man, concluded without specifying what happened next. Every other available ending described outcomes, who governed, what was built, how the region changed. The independent ending said only that the future would be whatever the Courier made of it, and that no one yet knew what that would be. The absence of a specified outcome was not a failure to complete the narrative. It was the narrative's honest acknowledgement that genuinely open futures cannot be described in advance. The ending withheld resolution because the situation it depicted was one in which resolution had not yet been determined. The Fallout franchise reached its 28th year of continuous existence in 2025. It had been developed under 3 separate studios, Black Isle, Bethesda, and Obsidian, and had expanded from a single game set in the California ruins into a universe spanning the continent, and now a television series entering its 3rd season. The internal timeline of the fiction covered nearly 3 centuries of post-war history. The series had been examining the same foundational question: what people do when the worst imaginable thing has happened for longer than many of the people currently engaging with it had been alive. It had become, without intending to, a form of institutional memory about the anxieties of the world that produced it. The phrase that has opened every entry in the Fallout series "War Never Changes" is not, on careful examination, a statement of despair. It is a diagnostic observation. The wars depicted across the series are fought over resources, over ideology, over fear, over the particular kind of pride that refuses to acknowledge that what it wants is not worth what it costs. These are the same reasons the Great War was fought. They are the same reasons the conflicts in the ruins continue. The franchise spent 28 years building variations on a single observation and did not run out of material. The observation was sufficient. The world kept providing evidence. The total written text contained in New Vegas, across its main content and all 4 expansions, exceeded 500,000 words. The Lonesome Road expansion alone contained approximately 40,000 words of spoken dialogue. A person who read every accessible piece of written material in the game would require weeks to complete the task. Most of those who spent time in the fiction read a fraction of what was available and still found the experience complete. The unread lore functioned the same way the unexplored terrain did. It was present. It gave weight to what was visible, and its existence mattered even when its specific contents were not accessed. 30 vaults were named in the Fallout universe across all official records. New Vegas directly engaged with or referenced 6 of them. Across all the games combined, 18 vaults had been explored in any meaningful detail. 12 named vaults remained sealed in the fiction present in the world's accounting, absent from any story. Their experiment parameters were not recorded anywhere accessible. The outcomes for their residents were not documented. 12 sealed doors existed somewhere in the fiction, with nothing behind them but the implication that something had happened there. The lore had scheduled them into existence and then left them. They remained as deliberate gaps, spaces that were known to be there and had never been opened. The cause of the Great War, the specific sequence of decisions and events that led to the launch on October 23, 2077, had not been explained in any official record across 28 years of the franchise's existence. The bombs fell. The phrase, "war never changes," was spoken. The ruins were built on that foundation. But who made the decision that ended the old world, and why they made it on that particular day, had no answer in any game, any terminal, any official publication. The mystery had been maintained across 3 studios, multiple writing teams, and decades of expanded lore. The origin of everything in the fiction remained, by deliberate choice, unknown. Some questions were more useful as questions than they would have been as answers. The 4 available endings of New Vegas each embodied a distinct political position. The NCR ending represented liberal democratic governance. The Legion ending represented authoritarian hierarchy. The House ending represented technocratic management by a single rational actor. The Independent ending represented self-determination without institutional structure. None of the 4 was presented as correct. Each was given the same narrative weight. The game did not advocate for any position. It built 4 complete versions of the future and made them all equally available. In a period when most entertainment with political content pushed toward a preferred conclusion, New Vegas built a structure that declined to push. The refusal to endorse was itself the most significant political choice the game made. Obsidian Entertainment was established in 2003 by people who had previously worked at Black Isle Studios, the studio that had created the original Fallout and its sequel. When Obsidian built New Vegas, the people doing the building were returning to something they had originally made in a different company after a decade of separation. The writers who shaped the tone of New Vegas had been thinking about these characters and this world for years before they were given the opportunity to return to it. The attachment was real, and it was long. The depth of the lore that resulted was not accidental. It was the product of people who had never fully stopped thinking about the place they were being asked to build again. More than 12 million people have walked through Good Springs, past Nipton, into the Lucky 38, and out the other side, with a different ending than the person who walked through before them. The entry point was the same for all of them. The door was the same. What was found on the other side was not. Each person who moved through that world in their own way, making their own choices, sitting in silence, in locations no one else chose. At the same moment, each of those experiences was singular. The game was identical for everyone who played it. The experience belonged to no one else. That is what the open desert was always designed to make possible. 201 facts. And somewhere in the hours they took to tell, the fiction may have become something quieter, not a game, not a story, but a landscape. One that has been waiting since 2010 for someone to move through it slowly enough to notice what was placed there without announcement. The unanswered email, the plaque with 216 names, the pending rocket mission, the star cap promise, the sound beneath the explosion, all of it preserved, all of it still there. And beneath all 201 facts, the same quiet truth that the series has been holding since the beginning. The world that made the ruins was not as different from this one as it is comfortable to believe. The same institutions, the same promises, the same arguments about who deserves what and what survival is worth. Fallout. New Vegas did not invent those questions. It found them in the sand and held them up to the light, framed in neon, in the last hours before sleep. The desert will still be there tomorrow, and so will you, which is more than most things in the ruins can say.